in some form of food and beverage. I turned 16 and got my first job at a Ruby Tuesday back in the 90s and early 90s at that, and ended up moving into food and beverage. I'm with the Court of Master Sommeliers. I'm a certified wine educator. Wow, we have Yegas is all the way from South Africa. Oh my gosh, what time is it there? Can you please put that in the chat? Jennifer Amon needs to be brought in. Anyway, so you know, these are all of my certifications. It's all a lot of nonsense, honestly. I think that Mother, Star Wars, Nerd, Yogi, Cork Dork, Roller Skater, and Crazy Cat Lady probably describe me better than anything else. In terms of like why I'm here, I did live in Japan when I was a teenager. So this is a picture of me when I was living there in 1990 with my dad. And I was really excited to have been able to get my my daughter to Japan actually at the beginning of this year before the COVID crisis. So that was pretty special for me to sort of recreate this image of me in the kimono. Obviously I haven't changed at all, right? With my daughter. Anyway, sorry, I'm trying to monitor our incoming as I do this. So we are on Zoom, and obviously there's a lot of bandwidth being taken up. I just want to make sure everybody is aware. If for some reason I get fuzzy, you can't hear me, let me know. If I get knocked off because my internet goes down, just hang tight. I'll get logged back in as soon as possible. It has happened to me a couple of times that my internet has decided to go belly up in the middle of a meeting. So hopefully we will go without too many technical difficulties today. Let's go back to the attendance here. So I want to just see, let's see, Susie is getting in here.
Hi, I think she's out of the Zoom meeting or she's frozen. She'll be back soon, okay?
Oh, that timing could not have been more impeccable. I'm back. Can you guys hear me? Somebody give me the thumbs up.
Welcome back.
I'm sorry. It's like as soon as did you hear me say anything about technical difficulties? That's what I want to know. I'm like in the middle of explaining it. I'll be right back in, and then everything went away. So that was awesome. Let me get back to my presentation here and to all, I've got like multiple screens and 45 things going on. Let's see. All right, can you guys see my screen again, hopefully?
Yes.
Great, all right. Kimberly is coming back. All right. Let's see if I can get all my windows open and we will try this again. Chat and participants. Come on. All right. So we're up to 24, which means I think only one person may not be here. So let me see here. All right, so this is me. I lived in Japan. That's my daughter. If we have technical difficulties, please stay tuned. Thank you. And let's get back into attendance. All right, so I did want to kind of do a really quick go around the room and ask you guys to just tell me your name, quoting Monty Python here, state your quest and your favorite color, maybe the airspeed capacity of a laden swallow. If you want to talk a little bit about, like, just quickly, what do you do, what brought you to sake or something like that, there's a number of people, so kind of go quick, but let me start here on the attendance sheet. I think Harry Kang, do you want to introduce yourself really quickly to everyone?
Yeah, this is Harry. I'm come from Arizona Mutual Trading.
Oh, great. That's so wonderful. So you worked with LA Mutual Trading or the one in
Arizona Mutual Trading.
Very cool, very cool. Well, welcome. Yeah. Thank you so much for being here. Next, I have Mitsuko Clark.
Yes, my name is Mitsuko Clark, and I'm also from Arizona Mutual Trading.
Oh, that's so great. Arigatou gozaimasu. Thank you so much for being here. So is Stephen Wilson, did I get you into the room? Are you here?
Yes, I'm here.
Great, let me mark you as here. Please introduce yourself.
I'm Stephen Wilson. I live in Monterey, California. Certified Som and ready to learn more about the sake.
That's awesome. I'm so glad. I hope that you haven't been completely and horribly smoked away by all of the awful fires happening. I know that's a little bit north of you, but
fires have been definitely in Napa. However, we're getting hit with all the tourism that Napa would be getting.
Oh my God. Wow. I've had some wonderful trips out to wine country that way, so we'll have to talk later about that. Melkor Roke, are you here? Maybe unmute yourself and say a quick hi.
Hi.
What brings you to us today?
Yeah, I'm not in the beverage industry at all, but I fell in love with sake after, trying out several vending machines in Japan.
Fantastic. Yeah, that's, I think, how I learned to first love sake when I was living there. So that's pretty cool. That's so cool.
Hello, everyone.
Hi, Jason Berg.
Hey, hello, everybody. Jason Berg from near DC. I've been a Marine for a long time, was stationed in Japan for a long time. We're heading back next year and just want to learn more about it. Thanks.
That's great. Well, thank you for being here. It's really nice to meet you. Hiroko?
Hi, everyone. My name is Hiroko Stanhope. I work for a Japanese American entertainment company involved in artist management, event organization, and then production. but I have become interested in sake movement in the US, and I wanted to learn more about sake and wanted to promote and hold the event eventually. And my favorite color would be orange.
There you go.
Today.
Okay. Thank you so much. And then I have Saiko-san, Saiko McIver. Is Saiko here? Maybe muted. Oh, Susie Lindquist made it. Saiko-san, まだいますか? じゃないね。Oh, no, she's here. She's here. Saiko-san, can you hear?
Hey, can you hear?
Hi. Now I can, yes.
Hi, this is Seiko MacGyver. I'm at Minneapolis, Minnesota. I lived in Seattle and San Francisco before we moved to Minneapolis, but I'm originally from Japan, Sendai, Japan. And my grandfather is from a sake brewery in Sendai. It's called Tensho. And I used to hang around at they call kura, where they're brewing sake, and I always loved the smell of sake, and I love sake in general. So I thought, well, I just want to learn a bit more about it than just drinking here and there and, enjoying it.
Well, I'm really glad you came. It's so nice to meet you. I visited Sendai once when I lived there. And actually, I got caught in a butterfly net at a mall. I was at a place where there were many places to shop. And these people caught me in a giant butterfly net and asked me to sing karaoke on Japanese TV. So that was an adventure when I was a teenager. That's my major memory of being there. I don't see Don Clevin in yet. I'm hoping he will join us later. And then I have Morris Saito. Do you want to say hi?
Hello.
Welcome.
My name is Morris Morio Saito. My family owns a restaurant in Santa Monica, California, and I manage the restaurant, and they asked that I come here and learn a little bit about everything. So
I'm glad you did. That's awesome. This is my favorite course that we teach, and it's full of everything that will help you in that, I think. So I'm glad that you decided to join us. And then I have Yegas Nido. Are you here? You might be on mute.
She's in the chat.
Oh, there she is. Her speaker's not functioning. Okay. International wine judge and selecting wine for, oh, very cool. South African Airways. Super cool. You know what? I wanted to know what time it is there. Visited Japan in 2018 to visit sake breweries and koshu wine. Wow. Favorite color is gold. Thank you. Wow. 22:30. That is some dedication. Thank you for being here. And then Saki-san, Saki McCarthy, who is her nickname for sake. How are you?
Right. Good. How are you? Yeah, there is a reason why I'm called Saki. That was my nickname in college. My real name is Risako, and it's a little different. Yeah. So Japanese and drink sake. So yeah, my ancestors are actually in Sendai. So I've been to Sendai once before, but I'm originally from Hiroshima. And yeah, so excited about this. And my favorite color is lavender. And yeah, I've known about sake because I love sake and I drink a lot of it. But I want to know more deep into it. I sometimes do the translation for mutual trading. So that's how I got to know Ueno-san.
Oh, that's so nice. Yeah. Maybe you're going to help us with the new Japan sommelier textbook. And
I think I already did that.
I think there's a new edition coming though, unless he's already done it.
Yeah. Yeah, I did 3 chapters. Yeah.
Oh my gosh. Yeah. ちょっと怖いだよ. Like, that's a hard one to be teaching. So anyway, when you guys get through this, you guys can take that class and tell me if you still like me when you're done. I've got Monica Lewis. Are you here? Let's see. Monica. I don't see her name. Oh, no problem. And then I have Jenna Mexico.
Hi,
That's such a cool name.
I know, right? I am from Great Lakes Wine and Spirits out of Detroit, Michigan, and we obviously drink a lot of wine. So this is really exciting for me because I want to dive into sake more.
I'm so glad you are. So for all of you guys who are here from Great Lakes, I had the pleasure of meeting one of your lords and masters, Mr. Rick Lopez, a few times when I was doing lectures for Jetro, and we got along famously because we're both major cork dorks and sake nerds, obviously. So I had spoken to him several times about trying to come out that way and do this class for you all in person, and of course, COVID ended up happening. So anyway, I'm really grateful to all of you for joining today in particular. Mark Suprenet, am I saying that right?
Yeah, we'll call it close. I tend not to say it if I can help it. I'm a certified sommelier with Great Lakes Wine and Spirits as well. Also from southeastern Michigan. I think we're all here because sake is a quickly growing product line, especially in our market, and so we need to be adept at talking about it to our customers. And my favorite colors are maize and blue.
Beautiful, beautiful. Joey Lopakak? Do I have that?
Hi, I'm here.
Hi.
I'm Joey. Like Mark and Jen, I work for Great Lakes Wine and Spirits, trying to learn a little bit more about sake. Always have been interested, and my favorite color is red.
Eric Vertis, you guys are a bunch there. I would fit right in with Guterbach, I think.
Hi there. Yeah, I'm Eric. I'm also with Great Lakes Wine and Spirits. I service the city of Detroit and parts of Oakland County. And since about 2017, I've been servicing a lot of sort of sake intensive customers. So I've been educating myself as much as possible, and I'm looking forward to the opportunity to learn some more and be able to provide even better customer service to those customers who are looking for sake. So I am a certified sommelier as well, and looking forward to adding some more credentials to my business card. So
I'm really, really glad to have you. Thank you so much. It's amazing. Tara, you and I talked a couple of times. I'm so glad. It's awesome. Thank you so much, Tara. Let's see, who have I got next? Susie Lindquist.
Hi, I am also from Great Lakes Wine and Spirits, and my favorite color is, I can't think of what it's called. This is what happens when you're 52. Oh my God. It's like blue, but not blue. Forget it. It doesn't matter. It's not important. Thanks.
I'm very happy to have you. We'll call it Carolina Blue because I'm in North Carolina. How about that? I've got Jen.
Teal.
Amon.
It's teal.
Teal. There we go. see. Jen Aman.
Hey, how are you?
Hi.
I'm also part of the Great Lakes Wine and Spirits team, a certified som, and just love the opportunity that we were given to be able to expand our knowledge on this because like Eric said, it is kind of a hot button in our area. People are really starting to get into it. So thank you.
I'm glad. Thank you. Katie Sallow. Katie, are you here? I see you. There you are. Oh, okay. Well, maybe we'll come back to her. Let's see. Yeah. Or if she wants to put her information in the chat, that'd be awesome. Kimberly Bricker.
Hi, I'm another Great Lakes Wine and Spirits attendee. My quest is to always be learning and growing. I feel like I've learned sake 4 times and then you don't use it, so you forget it all. So I'm excited to try to remember all the things I've forgotten and definitely learn some new things too. I too have a diploma from WSET and was always looking at their sake courses too. So I'm very excited to attend this class. My favorite color is gray.
Oh, that's awesome. So I am an educator for WSET for their classes as well and highly recommend them. So I teach for wine and for sake for them. And you would want to go into their level 3 course after this. This is a great stepping stone for that. So anybody that has questions about other certifications, please don't hesitate to ask. Normally when we do this live, I bring textbooks and other things to share with people so that they get an idea of additional options for their learning. And it's something I'm sad to not be able to share with you guys today in person. Let's see, and congratulations on that diploma, by the way. I got my diploma in 2012, and it can be a bit of an island to be on. So it's a huge accomplishment and very much worth celebrating. I think Amanda Goodman is next.
Hi, guys. I'm also from the Great Lakes team here in Michigan. This time last year, when I first came on with Great Lakes, I went to an introductory sake tasting course at a restaurant in Ann Arbor. And ever since then, we've just added more sake into our wine rack at home. And once this course became available, I jumped on it without even reading like the details of the day or the time. I just said, yeah, I'll take it. And so
I'm really glad you are. Thank you. I think I have John Onodera next.
Hi, this is John Onodera from Laguna Beach, California. I'm recently retired and looking to discover more about the sake industry to complement a newly formed sushi business.
Super cool. Thank you so much for joining us. And then Mr. Elias Mitri.
Hey guys, my name is Elias. My family name is Mitri, and I'm also in the business. I'm the real mixologist on Instagram. Started off as a bartender and made my way all the way up. I'm certified som, graduate from ICC, certified spirit specialist. I just love reading and studying more about everything that has to do with alcohol, from viticulture, culture, and the whole thing. Pretty excited for the course today. Thank you, everybody. Thank you, Sarah, for last minute chance.
Of course.
Join the class. I will attend the class. Yes.
Well, I'm really glad you're here.
And yes, thank you so much. And yeah, that's it. My favorite color is gold.
It's a good one. Thank you, Elias. So we're gonna go through a little bit about the exam, and I want to make sure everybody knows, like, interrupt me as much as possible. A lot of times when we do these classes or seminars, we have additional people helping to monitor, but it'll mostly be me. I think I have all the windows open. So if you want to type a question or comment into the chat, that would be great. Many of you commented on the growth of the sake industry. This was something that really captured my interest. Like many of you, my credentials started in the wine industry and spirits industry. And because I lived in Japan, I sort of got into sake. And it was pretty interesting over the years that I ran a portfolio in North Carolina. When I inherited it back in 2013, we were selling under $1 million in sake statewide. And by the time the COVID crisis began, we were selling around $3 million worth of sake wholesale in North Carolina. So it is really among the fastest growing categories in the wine and spirits industry right now in the United States and in many other parts of the world. We are seeing, growth on par with dry rosé, sparkling wine led by Prosecco, some specific spirits categories. So even though the well is small, it's growing at an incredibly rapid pace. And it's really definitely worth the attention. So thank you to everybody for being here and for investing the time. We are going to kind of motor through. There's a lot of information that's covered in the course. I am going to try to get at least one solid break in this evening if we can do that. But if you have to, just jump up and go use the restroom or whatever. No, you're not going to. There's no problem for that. We have done a very specific job of highlighting this PowerPoint as much as possible to help you in your success. I am not allowed to tell you what's on the exam. However, I can tell you that we've highlighted things in bold and in red. Moving on, we will be tasting, but please be responsible. At least be responsible, let's say, until 7 p.m. tonight, Eastern Standard Time. At that point, anything goes. It's the evening. You enjoy yourself. But, have fun, ask questions. I like this to be as interactive as possible. So please, 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 throw up, a question into the chat, or, if for some reason I don't see it, just unmute and throw it out there to the class. Just to put you at ease about the exam and what we're doing. We're tasting sake today simply for contextual purposes, and it's meant to help calibrate the palate and also help prepare you for the next step. So whether you choose to take the Kikisake Shi, which is the SSI Sake Sommelier course, which is pretty fantastic, or again, moving into WSET level 3, there are blind tastings on those exams. Sake is really viewed through a different, somewhat of a different lens in many ways. And one of my passions has been trying to help to unite the language between sake and wine. So we'll talk a little bit more about that. I tend to make a lot of comparisons back to wine to help those of us from that distributor background or restaurant background to help, describe things a little bit better and understand. There are certain things that we hold as truth about wine that can't quite be applied to sake. So we'll talk a lot about that as we taste. Again, no blind tasting on the exam. It's 100 questions, multiple choice. You get 75 correct, you pass. And the exam has a very high pass rate. So hopefully you're not feeling too nervous. The questions really are not designed to trick you. Some of you might have been involved with the Society of Wine Educators in the past. I am a certified wine educator, and I have a strong appreciation for their organization, but I think there are some ways, some of this may be true in the court as well, where it's a hard exam for a reason, but sometimes the questions are made even harder and you almost are scratching your head like it's so hard already. Why does this have to be harder? I really think that the test does a pretty good job of helping you find the best answer. Sometimes the wording is a little bit unusual just because of the English-Japanese translation, but most people don't have a problem or feel like the test was overly difficult. We have the exam scheduled. Please mark your calendar for 1 p.m. Eastern time. That's 10 a.m. Pacific time on October 20th. I will have you all go through Sake School. They will send out an invitation with a link for that exam. If for some reason this does not work out for you, this timing doesn't work at all, Sake School of America will help you find another time that you can schedule to take the test. But you'll have to kind of work that out with them. On the exam, temperatures will be noted in Celsius and Fahrenheit, so you don't have to memorize them both. Just memorize whichever is most comfortable for you. You should have received just over 50 practice questions, and they are a huge, huge, huge help. If you've not already, take the time, go through, answer them, maybe make flashcards out of them, do whatever you feel you need to do to help set that information to memory. It will definitely help you with your success on the exam. There are no Japanese characters. There's no kanji on the exam. So everything is written in English or romaji. I often sort of pause here, especially for my native Japanese speakers. In some ways, this can make the exam a little bit more difficult because you can't rely on the kanji to help you know what they're asking you. So maybe it's a good idea to try to study everything in romaji to help you get through it better. If for any reason you find you need to take this again, the retake fee is only $50. So even with that, it should kind of put you at ease. It's a pretty affordable endeavor to do again. So again, you'll be sent a Zoom link for the exam. You're going to have your picture ID to show. They want to make sure that it's you that's taking the test and not your doppelganger. Very, very important to note, you will need to log in for the exam on a computer. It's really the best if you can to use a laptop or some type of desktop computer. If you are going to use a mobile device, you need to have 2 separate mobile devices. And this is because you have to keep the Zoom open, essentially. You have to have your camera on the entire time. And if you're using a mobile device and you switch over to the exam, it won't keep the camera on you. So please do whatever you need to do for the exam to make sure that you're either on a computer or you have 2 separate mobile devices. It can be 2 phones, it can be an iPad and a phone or whatever. The exam, the camera is kept on, obviously, just to make sure that everybody is being honest. Before you get started, the person who's proctoring will kind of ask you to show the area that you set up to take the exam, just to make sure that you don't have any notes or anything to sort of distract you. The proctor will put a link in the chat that will take you to the exam. And the cool part about the exam is that, you click on it. So it actually makes the process go a lot faster. In my opinion, it takes much less time than filling in bubbles or writing on the exam. The format is very user-friendly. It allows you to skip questions and go back and answer them later. And the best part about it is that you'll get your results immediately. So you won't have to sit there waiting for somebody to grade your test. Are there any questions about this before I move on? I think it's pretty self-explanatory. I'll look at the chat if anybody has one. As we go through the information, so this program, as I mentioned, is really my favorite exam that we do. Oh, the duration of the exam. Yeah, so you have an hour to answer the questions. There's 100 questions and you have an hour. It's an interesting thought. I was thinking about this earlier where, if somebody was even motivated to try to cheat, I think that might actually slow you down rather than taking the exam just as it comes. So yeah, I think that's another reason why I emailed everybody with the vocabulary and stuff, because the vocabulary, I think, is a hindrance for some people. If you aren't familiar with the words that are on the exam, it'll slow you down as you read each question. So taking the time with the vocabulary and the glossary can be very helpful to speeding up the process for you. This is a very fact-based program. The content to me is highly relevant to what we do on a regular basis. I love the WSET program. I love the Japan Sommelier Association program. But there are points at these higher levels that you start to study to a level that is very beneficial to you, and it's very beneficial to other ultra nerds out there, but it's not necessarily beneficial to what you're doing daily, working with buyers, working with the general public, maybe talking to your friends. You get to that point where their eyes kind of glaze over because it's just too much information. I've mentioned before, this is the well of information that I feel that I go to most frequently to answer questions. It's all very detailed and covered, but in a way that's highly understandable. So I think you guys will find, whether you're just passionate about sake or you're in the industry, that you'll find a lot of information to help you sort of expand your horizons. We've just updated the book, which is pretty cool. There are a few areas where verbiage could be debatable, and I am always very open and will discuss that with you. So if you have any questions about that, let me know, but I'll always kind of chuckle on a couple of lines that where there's especially certain things that the Japanese people are just very, very proud of. And so we can chat a little bit about whether or not they get 100% credit for it or not. We'll talk about it as we go along. The data that's in the book is what you'll see on the exam. So many people get kind of like, oh, I should research this more. Maybe I should look into this online. Make sure that you note the data that's written in the book or in this presentation for your exam. And of course, we'll expand and clarify content as we go along. The first portion here is an introduction. It has nothing to do with the book. When we get to history, I'm going to emphasize that you pull out your Sake Advisor textbook, which you can't see because of my virtual background, but I'm holding it up. And I'll let you know when that time is. Hopefully you have 3 glasses ready to go. As we get toward the end of this introductory part, I will make a note and suggest that you grab your first 3 sakes and we'll pour and go through tasting. But this first part is just to kind of give you a sense of where Japan is and a little bit of a reminder of what sake is and kind of get everybody on the same page. So this is the world. It's round. We all live on it. This is where Japan is located. And the main thing here to just note is sort of where Japan is located between the lines of latitude 30 to 50 north. This is the temperate zone where pretty much all the major wine regions are located through California and Europe and through China. So very similar climate to most of the rest of this area here where many, many people live and where a lot of grapes are grown. This is a bit of a closer look at that with the lines of latitude. Again, here, Japan. And interestingly, you know, these southern islands of Japan coming quite far south into sort of subtropical zones here. Looking at the seasons and the way that it is as a long volcanic archipelago of many islands going very far north, very, very far south, there's 6 main climactic zones. So the first one kind of thing to look at here is how the seasons spread out. So they do have full 4 seasons. There's a whole area here on this west coast of Japan that's sort of the snow region. You can see here's natural snowfall in Niigata that's actually taller than this person standing here. Beautiful image here of Mount Fuji, mountains in Nagano Prefecture, and of course, where I really want to go snorkeling one day in Okinawa. But you know, seasonally, there's also a rainy season in Japan. It's a lot of rainfall there in general, quite a wet country. The Hokkaido area is the coolest, naturally being the farthest north. They have longer, colder winters than anywhere else and don't get quite as warm as in other places. This area along the Sea of Japan, again, is highly affected with seasonal snow. And part of this has to do with where the mountains are located all down through central Honshu here. So you get moisture that comes off the Sea of Japan and gets sort of stopped, and it just dumps snow all the way down through here. The Central Highlands, this is the area of Japan, again, here where you see Nagano, all the way coming down through Hyogo Prefecture here. This is where a lot of the finest rice is grown in Japan, area where it's very famous for Yamada Nishiki. This area here at the Seto Inland Sea, it starts to become more and more mild. And as you go further south, it gets hot and humid all the way down till you get to Kagoshima and even down to Okinawa. In the past, Kagoshima made no sake. It was really only famous for shochu. It was the only prefecture in Japan for many years that made no sake at all. But they do now have one brewery, and there may be an additional shochu producer that is making some sake as well, but I've had trouble finding anything other than the one. Another look here at the regions and a little connection here to the Toji guilds. Note here where it says it rains almost 60 inches a year in Japan. There is pretty much nowhere in the continental United States that gets that much rain per year unless a hurricane stalls on top of that area. There are some areas in Hawaii and along the coast of Alaska that have similar weather patterns. But just to put this in perspective, annual average rainfall in Seattle is around 45 inches per year. And we consider that part of the Pacific Northwest to be among the wettest parts of our country. So that gives you an idea of just about how much rain. And this, of course, to Japan. And it was basically written in there that Japan was the land of the rising sun. And that is
She's cutting off now. Hello?
I think she's gone.
Am I the only one online or still people? Hello?
Hello.
Hello.
So some of you are still here.
Yeah.
So
Yeah.
whoever's still on the list of participants is still here, right?
Yeah.
All right.
I'm still here. I don't see the
Yeah.
host.
This is like, they got scared in class. Everybody went silent.
Hide and seek.
I wonder if we should re-sign in or should we just wait forever?
We need to wait because she have to give it to us the permit to join the Zoom meeting.
That's
so.
true. Yeah, and it's kind of interesting because when you do a personal Zoom session, like with friends and stuff, the 45 minutes is free. And then it goes, you can't go beyond 45 minutes. And she went away exactly at 45-minute point. But this should be a business one. So, I see. Yeah, right.
She will be back right now. She's getting everything ready again. For some reason, she's getting disconnected, but she's coming back.
Okay.
Hey team, how's everyone feeling today?
We
Hello, hello.
good.
Ah,
Hello.
hi there. I heard that your teacher Sarah is having internet issues, so I logged on really quick. Whereabouts were you in the class? Do you know what you were just going over?
Rain and climate.
Rain and climate. All right.
Hey, I'm here, Rachel.
Hey.
Ugh,
I'm so
I want to
sorry.
cry. I want to cry.
Oh, your watch matches your dress.
Oh, cool. That's something to not cry about, right?
Mm.
All right. Guys, this is Rachel. She's my lifeblood.
Hello.
I apologize I ended up having to restart my computer. So can you all see my screen with the
Yeah, it's gorgeous.
fantastic. All right. So we were just here talking about the origin of the name Japan. Were you guys able to hear me on that part?
No, I think we were a slide or two back. We were right there.
The last thing we heard you say was something about rain.
Yeah,
Wow.
rain and climate.
All right. So yeah, basically I was saying that there are almost 60 inches of rain per year in Japan, and that there's really nowhere in the continental United States that gets that much rain. There are a couple places, I think, with Hawaii and on the coast of Alaska. But just to put it in perspective, average rainfall for Seattle is around 45 inches of rain per year. So, Japan just in general is quite rainy and has a lot of snow. And this is partly what contributes to the amount of amazing sake that they produce and the natural water sources that they have. Again, all 47 prefectures are now making sake. And this is just a little note on the main toji guilds that have an effect on regionality in sake, which we'll talk a little bit more about moving forward. You know what? I'm going to open up chat. And I'm going to throw my personal cell phone number out here to you guys, just in case. while I'm thinking about it. I have never had my internet go down twice in a presentation. If for any reason, Tara, how about you? I'm gonna have you just make a note of this, my personal cell number. If I get locked out, will you text me if you don't see me or something like that? And then I will come back. That'd be awesome.
Sarah,
right.
also, if you have really severe issues with your internet going forward, while the blips are off, you can use your company cell phone's personal hotspot.
As a hotspot.
Yeah, that's fine.
Yeah. Okay, thank you. Thank you, Rachel.
No problem.
So Japan, the kanji for Japan are the origin of the sun. It is the land of the rising sun, and there is sort of a story connected to where this name came from, basically based on a correspondence from the Prince of Japan to the Emperor of China, all the way back in 607 AD. So this is where the name Nihon comes from. And actually this kanji here, origin, has a lot of sort of etymology tied to it. And you'll see this when we think about honjozo, other types of kanji that we see on sake labels. You'll see this kanji quite a bit. So Japan is a very long archipelago, almost 7,000 islands. The four largest in order, Honshu is the main island, the one that looks a bit like a banana, Hokkaido, the northern island, the southern island of Kyushu, and this sort of small island here called Shikoku. And that altogether is, if you mush them up, is 97% of Japan's land. So thinking about how the other 3% are, almost again, 7,000 islands is pretty amazing. It is a very large population, lots of very large, amazing cities there, but it's still very much Japanese, 98.5% Japanese. So culturally, it's pretty incredible to visit Japan. If you've never visited, I highly recommend that you take the opportunity to do so. All 47 prefectures have their own highly revered history, cultural objects that they make, and lots of things that are really held and cherished. So definitely recommend that you take the opportunity ever if you have the chance to go there. I also think it's interesting for people from outside of Japan to kind of go and feel a little bit of that otherness when you're there. You definitely feel a bit like an outsider when you visit. The 70% of the country here is forest and mountains. So that's something else I think is pretty fascinating, that so much of the population of Japan is very much within the larger cities. If you take Japan by train, you'll go through lots of wide spaces that are mostly farms. You can go through across Honshu, you go through amazing mountains and tons of tunnels, you lose cell phone service. So, it's pretty interesting as you go around the country. For so many people to be so tightly packed into small spaces is pretty amazing. So the crux of the matter, what is sake? Hopefully you all know that it is the national beverage of Japan, and it is brewed from rice. It is a beverage made by fermenting rice. Rice is obviously a grain, and I always like to pause here and remind people that we talk about sake a lot. We call it like rice wine. Some people will choose to call it rice beer, but the way that sake is made is very, very unique, and it's why it's its own category on a list. Wine, beer, spirits, sake would all have their own separate spaces on shelves or on a menu because of the process for fermentation. So we're going to dive deeply into that. Tara is asking, when I said that highlighted and bolded items are important, did you mean in the booklet or on the presentation? I mean the presentation. So, you don't need to worry too much about the stuff that's bolded in here. Most of it will be repeated later. When we get to history, you can start following along in the book and make notes. Anyway, in terms of the history of sake, human beings love alcohol. So pretty much when we figure out how to turn something into alcohol, we're going to do it. So essentially, once rice cultivation came to Japan, people learned how to figure out how to ferment it. What's fascinating about it, though, is that it's only about the last 40 years or so that the modern styles of sake, the ginjo styles that we all know and love, became famous. And smack dab in the middle there were methods that were, dialed in that are still used today. One of the things that I'm amazed by with sake is how much of it still has to be done by hand. We don't have the technology to do a lot of the things that we see in wineries where things start to become automated. Even the largest of sake breweries, like places like Hakutsuru and stuff that have 3 gigantic breweries on an enormous complex, for their highest end sakes, they still are making those. Their koji is all done by hand. So processes that were figured out 1,000 years ago are still used today. And really sake that we know it now is a very modern type of beverage. Definitely very much a part of Japanese culture. It's used in the wedding ceremony. People bring sake as gifts when they visit one another in their homes. It's used in all sorts of ceremonies. And so, there's something about sake that is truly inseparable from the culture of Japan as a whole. So let's just chat about the ingredients briefly. So obviously sake is brewed from rice. Sake rice, though, is very specific and has a higher starch concentration than normal table rice. And thinking about rice, this is why it's important to be reminded that it has its own way of being brewed. So, wine is easy to produce because grapes are filled with fermentable sugar. When we eat grapes, they taste sweet. Glucose and fructose are small pieces of sugar that are small enough for yeast to eat and to transform into alcohol. And they are small enough for us to taste on our tongue. When we eat rice, though, it's filled with starch, and starch is a complex carbohydrate. It's a larger molecule, and it's too big of a molecule for us to taste. We cannot taste the sweetness. So the challenge is, how do you convert that starch in the rice into something that's fermentable by yeast? For beer, we do this by malting the barley, right? So barley is also a grain coming from a grass plant. And what they do with beer is they trick that little seed into thinking it's going to grow. So they place those barley seeds into sort of a dark, damp environment. And they say, hey, little seed, we want you to grow into barley. And so the seed starts to sprout, and it starts to create diastic enzymes inside of itself to break down the starch inside of itself so that it can grow into a plant. I was really pondered this for a long time, trying to understand, why do we not make sake like beer? Why do we not germinate the rice and capture the diastic enzymes that the seed produces? And the reason is that we can't, because the rice is polished before it's actually made into sake. You take away the germ, you take away the parts of that seed that would allow it to grow into a plant. So if you were to take a bunch of rice after it's been polished and put it into a dark, damp place and say, hey, we want you to grow into rice, please create diastic enzymes, it wouldn't work. It wouldn't be able to grow. So that's why sake has this special process. The water is very, very important for regionality in Japan, in sake. And it also gives the sake this beautiful soft mouth feel. I often like to call sake magical water with alcohol in it because there are many styles that are simply that clean. They can be very deceptive for how high the alcohol by volume is. And a lot of this has to do with how soft the water is. Soft meaning very low in mineral content. It's almost like just completely flavorless. It makes the sake taste incredibly light or very velvet in the mouth. Koji is that extra ingredient that allows us to convert the starch into fermentable sugar. So we will talk at length about koji and its unique role in sake production. But this is this is the solution that was come up with around the Edo period, where they were able to say, and a little bit before that actually, but able to say, hey, we don't need to chew the sake anymore, the rice anymore, and use our diastic enzymes in our mouth. We're going to be able to use this mold to convert the starch into sugar. And then obviously yeast is the magic that takes the sugar and converts it to alcohol. What's important about the yeast though for sake production is that they have a very strong effect on aroma, just like they do with wine and beer and other alcoholic beverages, but they also have to be very strong. They have to be able to survive in high concentrations of sugar, and they also have to be able to survive in high concentrations of alcohol. So most of the yeasts that are used commonly in Japan are very specific. They are ordered from the Brewing Society of Japan. There have been many types of yeast that were sort of found and then kind of fell out of fashion. There's constant experimenting with yeast. So for the same reason that, certain styles of dry rosé are very popular because they're using select yeast to help them smell almost like, cherry blossoms and watermelon Jolly Rancher candies, the same styles of select aromatic yeast are becoming more and more popular in Japan. And really more than the rice, the yeast itself has a much higher impact on the resulting aromatic characteristics of the sake. So I mentioned earlier that there are rice for sake that are specific to sake production. These are called sakamai. This is the kanji for sake, and this is the kanji for rice. So they all, again, have higher concentrations of starch. And you can see this as this white heart. This is called the shinpaku in the center. What's interesting is that the rice in terms of texture is pretty homogeneous throughout. The reason that you are seeing that white heart is because these sake specific rice have a crack in the center that refract the light and create that shadowy space in the center that's highlighted. There is definitely a higher concentration of starch in the center, but it's not like a soft center. I always like to emphasize that to people. In terms of rice that's farmed in Japan for sake production, these are the top three. Yamada Nishiki by far is the most popular, followed by Gohyaku Mangoku. And then Miyama Nishiki has also become, particularly in central Japan and parts of northern Honshu, we see a lot of Miyama Nishiki being used. What's fascinating about this is that these top three represent more than 50% of the total amount of rice that's grown for sake production. And there's more than 100 varieties that are used for sake production. So pretty interesting to see how many people use these rice. Yamada Nishiki makes these very showy styles, and Gohyaku Mangoku make very delicate styles. So, and Miyama Nishiki tends to be a little bit more ricey in style. So it's kind of interesting how these top three sort of fill the top three seats in terms of styles of sake that people tend to like the most. So 80% of sake is water. Pretty easy to kind of figure out. If you think about a beverage, it's about 15 to 16% alcohol on average. And then the rest of that is going to be, other types of acids and sugars and other dissolved components. We talk about hard and soft water in Japan. It's important to note that all the water in Japan is softer than the majority of water sources in the United States. So we're talking within a fairly small spectrum in terms of hardness and softness. And I'll show you what that looks like a little bit later on a chart. Iron and manganese being sort of very harmful for sake, and then other beneficial minerals being very important for sake because they add vitamins for the yeast, essentially to help keep them going through the fermentation. A lot of this is actually quite similar to what we study in wine in terms of being positive and negative. Koji, a mold that is unique to Japan. So this is one of the reasons that I sort of pause and I say that sometimes the language is a bit proprietary. Koji actually comes from China, but the yellow koji, the key koji that's used to make sake, is a unique style to Japan. It's used to make miso and soy sauce. And koji is another part of sake production that is getting more and more exploration now. We're seeing a lot more breweries experimenting with different types of koji. We have breweries adding some white koji to their production, even a couple of people rumored to be experimenting with black koji. But yellow koji is the most important one. 99% of sake is used 100% with yellow koji. This is kind of what it looks like as it germinates, and you can see this kind of close-up of it growing around the rice. Important to note, you can see here where the green spores of koji are being sort of tossed over freshly steamed rice. The koji is never allowed to grow long enough to where it actually goes to spore on the rice that's used for sake production. The koji that is used to inoculate the rice has been specially grown quite frequently on barley seeds, actually. The producers purchase this koji that's gone to spore, and then they will shake that over their rice. That they don't allow it to go to spore because that would allow the koji to taste moldy, and that would give a moldy taste, of course, then to the sake. It's Japan's national fungi, which I think is really funny too. So this is a little diagram of how this all works. So you see the koji spores are sprinkled around the rice. They grow into the rice, and the koji says, oh, here's a great place for me to live, and here's a starchy center for me to burrow into, and I can use this starch for me to grow. So the koji is what produces the diastic enzymes that break down the starch and form sugar. This is, of course, then edible to my yeast, and the yeast can then produce alcohol. One of the things that's fascinating about this little diagram here, you see that there are actually 7 little spores here of koji. I actually had a conversation once with a producer asking him, because they're so cautious about the way that they spread the koji on the rice, what is their ideal number of spores per rice grain when they're making koji? And he actually looked at me dead in the eye and he said, if we had it perfect, there would be 7 to 12 spores of koji per individual grain of rice. So kind of a mind blow there that, we made this sort of wonky little diagram, and it's actually pretty accurate for how many individual spores of koji they want to grow on each piece of rice. This is what the yeast looks like under a microscope. It self-breeds, it divides up into mothers and babies, and during its active phase will be actively reproducing and actively consuming sugar, actively consuming alcohol, until ultimately it gets to a point where enough alcohol is produced that the yeast itself can no longer live. It is Saccharomyces cerevisiae. This is the same yeast strain that is used to make wine and also ale beers. So lots of bread, all of that, very familiar yeast to most of us in the industry. So the koji and the yeast work together in a symbiotic relationship. This is, again, that multiple parallel fermentation that helps to produce the sake. But ultimately, in exactly the same tank, you have yeast that is fermenting sugar into alcohol. And the koji is breaking down the starch to produce that sugar for the yeast, together in the same tank. The yeast, again, having a tremendous effect on the aroma of the sake, and the producers being very selective about which yeast they choose. Some yeasts are chosen because they're just very powerful. They're able to make large amounts of alcohol. But most people are looking closely at what the aromatic compounds are for their jizake. So this is, again, similar diagram to before, but just reminding you that this is ongoing during fermentation, that the koji is still working. The enzymes of koji are still working in this tank symbiotically with the yeast. Where this starts to get really interesting is when you start to plot the fermentation on a graph. So most of you who've studied wine would know that grapes are harvested at a certain level of Brix or balm, right? Balm being the potential alcohol, right? So if you harvest grapes in a warm climate, like somewhere in California, at say 14% balm, that is going to ultimately say you can have 14% alcohol achieved in that wine. Nice ripe grapes, high level of alcohol. In sake, though, the balm, the potential alcohol in that brewing tank, will never reach higher than around 8%. And this is because the koji is continually breaking down starch into sugar, and the yeast is continually eating that sugar and breaking it down to alcohol. So when you plot it along a graph, it's this really interesting thing where you have this sort of even line of sugar, and as the yeast is working, alcohol starts going up. Whereas with wine, you have this high level of sugar that then drops as the yeast consumes it all until it's dry. So kind of really another way that's very unique. And it's the reason why sake can ferment up to over 20% alcohol naturally, highest level of alcohol that's naturally achieved in a natural fermentation without any addition of other alcohol or distillation in the world. So let's talk about regionality. This is something that's getting more and more focused in Japan, especially now that they have their own GIs and people are really starting to notice, hey, this sake from here is very unique. So again, all 47 prefectures do make sake. One of the things that affects how the style of sake that they produce are the toji guilds. So again, these are groups of people, tojis, who get together and share their secrets. This Nambu Toji up here in Iwate is the most famous and influential. They're the largest guild of tojis. At one time, there were toji guilds really spread all over Japan, but their numbers are diminishing. People are starting to look to other sorts of guiding groups for sake production in their prefectures. So that's something that's sort of interesting for us to kind of keep an eye on moving forward. The temperature and the climate changes from north, east to southwest also has a huge effect. So obviously Hokkaido being quite cool, they make very light, clean, delicate styles of sake. Coming all the way down here to Kyushu, regions like Saga, they make a much richer style of sake. The warmest regions all the way down here in Okinawa, again, still more famous for shochu. But the temperature does have an effect because this affects also how much snow and rain, and does also affect the water source. So many people use snow melt for their water. Others have beautiful sort of artisanal wells. If you ever have a chance to visit a sake brewery, they'll often offer you an opportunity to taste their brewing water, the brewing water being very select and typically different than the water that they use in the brewery for other types of purposes. So water being very, very important. In terms of proximity to the mountains or the ocean, when you're closer to the ocean, you're more likely to have a surface water, a very lower in mineral content. When you're in the mountains, you tend to be a little bit more likely to have a higher mineral content in the water. That's sort of a loose generalization. But this also affects, elevation affects temperature. It also, of course, affects how much snow you have. Regional cuisines are also tremendously affected by where you are. People who are closer to all of this coastline tend to do a whole lot more with seafood. People who are closer to these mountainous areas do a lot more pickles, rooted vegetables, hot pot and meat type dishes. So the style of sakes that developed in these regions, much like the foods of Italy developing alongside their wine, all of that has had an effect as well. Regional rice types are becoming more and more influential. Each prefecture is starting to become a bit more proprietary about their rice types. There are several rice types from Hiroshima, rice types in Yamagata that are becoming more and more famous. Yamada Nishiki from Hyogo being the most famous in all of Japan. And interestingly, whether or not the region is famous for shochu. So looking through here in the island of Kyushu and down through Okinawa, this is where they do shochu country. And I've actually spoken to producers there who said that they purposefully have made a richer style of sake, because if they made the sake very light, people might confuse it with their shochu. So I think that's kind of an interesting thing to know. This is kind of an eye chart on Zoom. I apologize. We're going to be talking about these different regions a bit more because they're the locations of some of the most famous water sources. But Niigata is famous for its snow country and its sort of tanre, karakuchi, kirei style of sake, meaning light and dry in the mouth and very like pristine, beautiful, clear, clean type of sake. In Fushimi area of Kyoto, they have a very famous water source here that makes these very soft, round styles of sake. And the more minerally style of water from Hyogo, the Miyamizu here, tends to make a bit more of a more mineral-driven, earthy, ricey style of sake. This is updated snowfall information. Really the only thing that's important here for you to note is that Niigata is the snowiest region of Japan in general. But I threw in this map here just to kind of show you where the snow country is in Japan. And again, I mentioned earlier that all this moisture comes off of the Sea of Japan and gets blocked by the Japan Alps that go down through the center here of Honshu. Many famous mountain ranges kind of pepper through here. You know, Japan is a volcanic archipelago. There's a lot of tectonic activity, lots of new young mountains all through here. They block this moisture. And it just tends to drop snow all through here. So taking a look at the numbers here, I want to make sure everybody understands this terminology. Nihon Shudo. This is the sake meter value, and it's a loose indicator of how sweet or dry the sake is. It's essentially a measure of specific gravity. The higher the number, the drier the sake. This is information we're starting to see more frequently on the backs of sake labels, even if it's just done in a chart, kind of like the Riesling chart that we see on some wine bottles, because it can be really difficult to tell just by the name of the sake or the category of sake whether or not it is going to be sweet or dry. So the sake meter value is intended to help people know how sweet or dry the sake is. It's important to note, though, that sweetness is balanced by acidity. So there are some sakes out there that have higher acidity, so they don't seem as sweet, even if that sake meter value is lower and it's showing a bit more a sweet character. The acidity or shudo is a measure of acidity. And again, this, as I mentioned, higher acidity makes the sake taste drier. It balances out sweetness. And then we come to seimai buai. So this is the rice polishing ratio. And this is what is used along with whether or not alcohol is added to determine the grade of the sake. The number that you see is how much remains after polishing. So the higher the number, the higher the seimai buai, the lower the grade. If you've taken off only a little bit of the outside of the rice and you leave a lot of the rice remaining, you have a lower sake grade. The lower the number, the more you've polished away, the higher the grade. So we'll take a look at this in a few different formats. Please interrupt me if you have any questions on any of this. I'm trying to get through a lot of content in a shorter amount of time. Oh, and now would be a good time, actually, we probably have time to just break when we get there, but we're gonna do our first tasting here in a moment. So I'll give us a chance to grab those bottles here in just a minute. So here again are the grades, and I've got about 4 different ways that we'll look at this throughout the presentation. But ultimately, you know, on this left side, we have all of what are called junmai sakes or pure rice sakes. And on the right side are all the sakes that have alcohol added. I always pause here because there's always somebody in the group that has the impression that adding alcohol is bad. And this is connected to some things that happened historically in Japan. There was a time when the amount of alcohol added, where that alcohol came from, was not very well monitored. And it had a lot to do with the rice shortage that happened during World War II. Laws were changed tremendously at the late part of the 20th century. And now when they add alcohol for these special designated sakes, it's highly regulated. So I always like to point out that when producers are submitting their sake for competition, about 85 to 90% of the sake that goes for judging has added alcohol. These are sakes that are not released to the public. They are an art form. They're the finest expression of a sake brewery. It's the Toji's pride. Made once a year, sent to competition, and they, again, invariably have alcohol added. So don't ever want to think that because there's added alcohol that there is something wrong with it or that it's not the best quality. Alcohol can be added for a reason, and several reasons, in fact, and we'll talk about that more as we get into process. So the other thing I like to emphasize when we look at this is that the higher the grade is not necessarily a term of endearment or a measure of quality. There are people out there that, you know, because the Daiginjo category with so much rice polish can be fairly expensive, tend to think, oh, well, that just must be the very best quality of sake available. That would be like saying that, you know, only Napa Cabernet Sauvignon is good. Within Napa Cabernet, there are highs and there are lows. So there are highs and lows within the Daiginjo category. Here, what happens is the overall impression of the sake is different based on how much the rice is polished. So within the Junmai category or the Ginjo category, you can have sort of a range of things going on, but it narrows the range so that you may know automatically that the Ginjo sake is going to have a little bit of a floral and fruit character, maybe a little bit of a rice character. The Junmai is going to be much more ricey, maybe a bit more umami driven, very savory. So these are indicators of style, not quality. So looking at the left side, the term Junmai always drives me a little bit crazy because it is both a proper noun, its own category, but it's also like an adjective where you see Junmai Daiginjo, Junmai Ginjo, or a special Junmai. Where Junmai is its own category, all it's telling you is that the sake is made from 4 ingredients. It's basically like the German laws of purity for beer, where you can only have 4 ingredients there too, being hops and yeast and barley and water. Here it would be rice, water, yeast, and koji. Only 4 ingredients allowed. Because you're only using 4 ingredients for Junmai sake, they don't tell you how much you have to polish it. There are many types of Junmai out there that are rough polished Junmai. Many breweries also will just kind of across the board for their special designation sake say, well, our Honjozo sake is 70%, so we'll use 70% for our Junmai. But note that there is no specification for rice polishing for just basic Junmai. As we go up this left side here, where it becomes an adjective, it's basically telling you that none of these sakes have any added alcohol. If you do not see Junmai, they've added alcohol. If you do see Junmai, it's only made with 4 ingredients. And then these other designations start to be where we see, okay, they're polishing this rice more. So the Daiginjo, they have to take off at least 50% of the outside. Ginjo, at least 40%. Tokubetsu, generally, it's 40%, but there's some additional designations there that we'll talk about a little bit more. Ultimately, my sort of favorite way of describing Tokubetsu Junmai or Tokubetsu Honjozo sake is that there are sakes that are treated with the same care that Ginjo grades are, but they don't have the same aromatic characteristics of Ginjo sake. They lack the Ginjo ka, that fruit and floral character that we look at with Ginjo sake. On this alcohol added side, Honjozo literally translates as true brew. So you're literally using kanji in the explanation of this category to help give people faith that Japan was going back to original practices of adding alcohol to sake, which they've actually been doing for hundreds of years in Japan. So it was sort of an idea to help the public get some faith back about these alcohol added sakes as still being high quality. And because they're adding alcohol, they add the rice polishing rule for the Honjozo. And then once you start going up the line here, it just matches the other side in terms of rice polishing degrees. Any questions about any of this? I know it's a lot of information at the beginning, but I think it gets everybody on the same page. Feel free to unmute or to type me a question. Oh, I have kittens and one of them just climbed up onto my shoulder. If anybody wants to say hi to one of my kittens, they're crazy.
I have a question if you don't mind.
Yeah, please.
So technically what you're saying that you can make good sake with any Junmai method, right? From all 5. Like you can make good or bad sake, right?
Yes, absolutely. And a lot of this has to do with the producer. It has to do, with their principles and how the sake is stored. So Eric is saying, is Tokubetsu generally less fruity floral because of different yeast use or different techniques? So generally, it's the yeast. A lot of times they're using a table rice in their Tokubetsu sakes or a regional rice that's not quite as well known. So there are a lot of different factors. A lot of Tokubetsu sakes also tend to be a little bit drier than some of their cousins. I actually had a long conversation with several different brewers about Tokubetsu because it's a really gray category. And a lot of people seem to lack a lot of understanding. It also doesn't seem to be very well regulated, generally speaking, when it comes to labeling laws in Japan. So my general experience is that the majority of tokubetsu sakes don't have the same aromatic characteristics as the ginjo. When they look at ginjo, it must have fruit and floral notes. If you've made a sake with the same level of care, rice polishing, ingredients, everything else, you can call it your special sake. Your tokubetsu means special, where it's made with these, same care, but maybe doesn't have the same profile as something that would be ginjo. Thank you, Tara. My kitten is very cute. This is another way of looking at the classification system that Tim Sullivan came up with, which I think is pretty cool. And what it allows you to see is that the rice polishing regulations are standards that are not always followed. When it says a minimum of 60% of the rice must be remaining for it to be called a junmai ginjo or a ginjo sake, many producers actually polish their sake more, right? So this is just the standard. It has to hit this in order to be called a junmai ginjo. But you can make a junmai ginjo that would technically qualify as being a junmai dai ginjo. And then you can take your junmai dai ginjo and you can polish it even more and say, this is a, even very low rice polishing junmai dai ginjo and it's extra expensive. We see that with lots of brands. Some of them will actually just call their sake the number of the seimai buai. And there's been a large, long-going race competition in the dai ginjo category to see who can polish their sake rice the most. We do have a 1% sake in the mutual portfolio from Tate no Kawa. It's actually, it's basically the Petrus of sake. It's several $1,000s a bottle wholesale. So they've polished off 99% of the rice and then made sake with the dust that is left over. Pretty incredible. So here you see junmai has no rice polishing requirement. Futsushu, the base of the pyramid, also has no rice polishing requirement. Here at Honjozo, they have to take off at least 30%, but they can go further. Again, ginjo, at least 40%, but they can go further. Dai ginjo, at least 50%, but they can go further. All right, so these are examples of descriptors, and we'll go through all of these more. Most of these are probably terms you're pretty familiar with, like nigori being cloudy sake, maybe taru being cedar aged styles of sake. These are styles that can be combined for infinite possibilities. That being said, when we look at these terms, they cannot be combined. So there's no such thing as junmai dai ginjo tokubetsu honjozo sake or junmai ginjo honjozo. There would only be junmai or ginjo or junmai dai ginjo. The category is fixed, and then all of these terms can then be added on. So what you end up is something that looks kind of like this, where you'll see that you have a style here. Oops, I highlighted this purple. I need to fix that. But junmai dai ginjo being a category, and it's muroka nama genshu. It's unfiltered, unpasteurized, and undiluted. Ginjo, meaning alcohol added ginjo, that's nama or unpasteurized. Sorry, that should be black, guys. Little typo there. Sparkling and nigori. Honjozo nama genshu. These three standards here are actually these three sake bottles that you see on the right. So lots of possibilities with the descriptors that give you more information, but all the sake categories themselves are actually fixed terms. These are the top sake breweries by volume. Nothing here that you need to memorize, but it's important to note that the top 10 breweries in Japan control more than 50% of the business. And a lot of this goes back to the sort of corrupt tax system that they had back in the day. So I'll kind of circle back to these facts a little bit later. But there were a number of breweries that were larger that sort of survived through tough times in Japan. They have an enormous percent of the market share. And then you have, over 1,000 other small breweries, tiny little family operations that are kind of struggling to keep up. All right, grab bottles 1, 2, and 3. I'm gonna go put these rambunctious kittens away, and I'm gonna grab my bottles, and I'll be back here in just a minute and start to taste. If you don't already have it, make sure you have your tasting sheet up, and we'll talk about them. Go ahead and pour, and you can take a moment to start to taste through, and I'll be right back. Let me get these little beans there.
You want some Maya?
These are 2-ounce bottles, guys, and you can probably get away with just pouring about half for each. Yeah. Oh, is that Tara? You know what? I think it was on an attachment to, let me get that out to you. Did anybody else not get the updated tasting sheet? Go here. Okay. If I send this to you, can you forward it to him? Is he on your team? Or, okay, let's see.
So what numbers we grabbing? 1, 2, 3 from the box?
Just bottles. Yep, bottles 1, 2, and 3. Yeah.
Thank you.
Open. Let's see, and that was Jason Berg. You did not receive it?
So I just went and looked. I didn't receive a tasting sheet. I also did not receive a number 2. I've got a 1 and a 3.
You didn't get number 2?
No, ma'am.
Oh no, it's a tragedy. I'm so sorry. Let's see here.
If there's a way to email the
I'm doing that right now. I'm going to send you a tasting sheet. Yeah, there weren't any tasting sheets in the box, but I sent them with my email out to the group with my link to the Quizlet and stuff. So people might have missed that attachment.
I didn't get a link to a Quizlet. I only got the calendar invite for this class.
You didn't get the email?
No, it was just a calendar invite that had the different links in it for the for how to connect.
And you're Berg JB at Hotmail?
Yes.
All right. What is this doing? I see. No. All right, let's see. Jason, I'll let them know about your missing sample. I hope that's.
Yeah, I appreciate it.
Yeah, I got bottle number 1, 2, and 3.
Okay. All right. This email is coming to you guys right now. It has the updated tasting sheet, and there's like a tasting mat on here. And then Jason, if you scroll down, you'll see there's a little link to a Quizlet here that has all of the it's all the terminology from the glossary that you can practice through. It's coming now. All right. Okay. Jason, did you get the email? Did that come through for you?
It has not come through yet.
How about you, Tara? Will you check and make sure Jason didn't go to your spam or something like that? Maybe it doesn't know me. If it does have attachments, sometimes mail will do that.
Yeah, let me check real quick.
All right. So hopefully you guys have your bottles poured and you have tasting sheets in front of you. We're going to go through the first tasting a little bit more closely together. And then the rest of the tastings throughout the class, we'll just kind of go through a little bit more quickly. But I want to start by discussing some techniques for evaluating sake with you. So the first thing to note is that sake is a lot clearer than wine. So generally speaking, when you are asked to evaluate the color of a wine, you're told to sort of tilt the glass and hold it and kind of look down through it at a white background. When it comes to sake, what you want to do is you want to actually hold a white background. Find the white background behind the glass. And you want to look through the widest space. I'm going to turn off my background because it is making it impossible for you guys to see. Let's see. There you go. So you want to look at the sake's color through the widest part of the glass at a white background. Because when you tilt them all, toward a white background like so, they just all end up looking as clear as water. So in order to discern the color, you want to do that. So the first thing we do is look at clarity, and clearly all of these are clear, right? They're not intentionally cloudy, they're not murky or hazy. Does anybody want to hazard on like sake number 1? What are they thinking about the color? So, I mean, for me, looking at all 3 of these carefully.
Number 1 is clear, right? A little bit shady, yellowish.
Yeah,
right?
yeah.
A little bit on the edges.
The greenish yellow for me would be, and I would add that with a pale. I would say it's very, very pale yellow, or greenish gold, or greenish yellow. Yeah. Number 2 has a similar color to it. Number 3, though, is truly a colorless sake. There's no color on sake glass number 3. So I just want to make sure that each person sort of looking at their 3 glasses. A lot of times I'll sort of set my glasses up, if you guys can see this, in front of me. And then I'll hold that white background behind it, and I'll evaluate and compare them one by one. So if you're looking at my screen, my 1, my 2, my 3, 1 and 2 have just a barest hint of color. Number 3 would be colorless. The next thing that we do is viscosity. And with viscosity, we're looking at the legs or tiers. We're going to take the sake glass and we're just going to kind of tilt it away, maybe hold it up to the light and see the way that the tiers travel down the side of the glass. Tiers that last a long time or are very close together are an indication that you can have higher alcohol. They can also be an indication, especially if they really cling to the glass, you almost see like a rainbow effect of a high sugar content in the sake. I always will check the viscosity with my eyes and then double check viscosity in the mouth. Generally speaking, most sakes are about 15 to 16% alcohol by volume. Most sakes at 15 to 16% are going to be at medium for viscosity. So sake's lower alcohol by volume would then tend to be a little bit on the lower side. If it's very high in sugar, it can again get very viscous. So that's why I always like to double check in the mouth. The next thing we do is we get to the nose, and we want to decide, is the sake in good condition, or is there something wrong with it? Is it faulty in some way? We would never give you a sake that was faulty, so you can sort of just note in an exam that all sakes are going to be considered clean. But if you would ever get like stale fishbowl water or really, really bizarre sour smell, or if the sake is just very murky, mushroomy, sometimes that can be a sign that it's out of date, and that might be considered a fault. So let's talk about intensity. I want to do a little tasting experiment. We'll all grab sake glass number 1. And we just want you guys to give it a sniff without swirling your glass. And then I want you to take it and give it a really good swirl and smell it again. And then I just want you to take the palm of your hand and place it over the top of the glass and just hold it there for a minute. You can give it a little swirl if you'd like. Keep your hand there and then bring the glass up to your nose and open and smell. I do this with everything I taste in a blind exam, whether it's wine or a spirit. I do it with everything in my glass, because sometimes there are aromas that are so volatile, they actually will be escaping the glass before they make it to your nose. So just by standing and having your palm over the top of the glass, you can get a little bit of that stuff that's flying out. We're going to put that glass down now and go to sake glass number 2. And I want everybody to kind of run through sort of the same thing, just smelling it without swirling it. And maybe giving it a little swirl. And we'll do the same for sake glass number 3. So what I wanted to kind of get at here was talking a little bit about intensity. So you'll notice that as I'm sort of smelling my sake glass number 1 is so aromatic that I can hold it well below my nose and I can smell it. It's got lots of flowers or stuff going on here. There's strong spice aroma. But I mean, my glass is sort of 2 inches below my nose and I can smell it. So when you can smell a sake from here, this would be considered, a high intensity aroma character. Sake glass number 2, it's a little harder for me to detect from down here. I find that I have to kind of put my nose right at the level of the glass, and then it starts to, I'm like, oh, there's the aroma. So that's medium intensity. And when you get to sake glass number 3, this is kind of in between medium and low. I'm getting a little bit of something when my nose is right at the glass, but I get a whole lot more when I really have to put my nose down in the glass. Do you guys notice this? Are you all following me with this? Is anybody?
Yes, I'm following you. Beautiful.
Very, very good. So in terms of measuring intensity, is it blowing up at you? It's kind of like, think about New Zealand Sauvignon Blanc sort of explodes out of the glass, very high intensity aromas. Maybe something a little bit more subdued, like a Chablis, you have to put your nose down into the glass. We're seeing some of the same thing here. So that's that low, medium, high. High, you're way up above the glass. Medium, you're right at the level of the glass. And low, your nose is down inside of the glass.
And this is all by the yeast, right? Yeast can control that.
It's almost entirely yeast, but there's also from the rice itself, as it melts, will release aroma and flavor into the sake as well. But yeah, the yeast has a huge impact on this. And sake number 1 actually has a specific yeast that's pretty aromatic that's definitely contributing there. So I'm gonna, again, pause on complexity here, and let's talk a little bit about the aromas that we're getting. And we'll just start here with sake number 1. So are we smelling fruit?
Yes.
Yeah, we're definitely smelling fruit. I'm just going to go down the first thing. Are we smelling floral characteristics? Yes. What about spice? I get some exotic, like, that licoricey clove, kind of baking spice thing going on here, which is pretty much a characteristic of some very high aromatic yeast here. Does it smell like rice or grain to anyone? Yeah, I mean, it's made from rice, right? So there's definitely a little bit of that going on. I think it's covered by a lot of the fruit and floral, but it's there. What about fresh characteristics? Anything vegetal, any herbal characteristics?
Green bell pepper.
Yeah, there's definitely like a fresh note, like a little bit of a almost like sweet grass, sweet summer grass, a little hint there. I also get a little twinge of that sort of spun sugar note, that confected character that's noted under other. There's probably a number of other things that you can detect here, but the reason why I wanted to sort of run through this is that, there are many different categories here. I think the 3 main categories that shine are fruit, floral, and spice. The more of these categories that you can note, the more complex the sake is. There are some very, high grade daiginjo sake that only smell like flowers and fruit. And they can be amazing, but they're actually relatively simple. And then when you start going down the line into some of the lower grades, all of a sudden you're adding lots of unique characteristics. Maybe you have a yamahai or a uniquely made sake that has a whole lot more umami and savory stuff happening. So when we talk about complexity, the reason I wanted to skip that before we even got into it was just to note complexity has to do with the number of things you can say about the sake, the number of descriptor characteristics. This is a very simplified sheet. You guys can write down anything else that you're getting. But I just wanted to kind of pause there and say, for me, the complexity on this sake is between medium and high, or maybe right around medium. It's not as highly complex as some sakes that are made using different techniques, but it's definitely got some nice notable complexity and number of categories that we can talk about. So this then takes us to the palate, and we'll come back to some of these more specifics in aroma and flavors on the other sakes, but we are going to taste back and forth for dryness and acidity and body. So let's just take a quick sip of sake number 1. Take a moment to roll that around. Take a moment to sort of think. So it's very fruity, but it has a fairly dry finish. It's not a sake that is lingering and cloying the palate. I want to compare this though to the other 2 sakes. So take a moment, and what I'd like you to do is compare back and forth between sake glass number 2 and number 1, and then number 1 and number 3, just to sort of see which seems to be the most dry.
Should I drink water before tasting 2 sakes or no?
No, you don't have to. I think sometimes that can, especially with this activity, can mess up your perception.
I think number 3 is dry.
Mm-hmm. When you go from number 3 back to number 1, it tastes really sweet by comparison. Would you agree? And when you go to sake glass number 3 after number 1, it's very dry.
Yeah.
Wow.
Huge difference.
Mm-hmm. And sake glass number 2 is kind of in the middle. It's a little, I mean, it's a little bit more in common, I think, with number 1 than number 3. Okay, so, you know, the reason I'm having you guys taste back and forth is because the spectrum here is not very wide. You know, when you're tasting wine and you taste a very dry, you know, Loire Valley Sauvignon Blanc with high acidity, and then you compare this to, let's say, a sweet style, low acid Gewürztraminer, you know, it's a huge range in terms of sweetness and dryness. Within sake, it's a little bit more narrow, and confusing about the acidity in sake is that there are other acids, the umami causing acids, glutamic acid and others, succinic acid, that we don't necessarily perceive as sour. We perceive as sort of spreading around the palate. So you have to kind of separate your total impression of acidity a little bit from just being a sour taste in the sake. But thinking about how sour these sakes are, I want you just to kind of go between the glasses, take a moment to see which ones make you salivate the most. For me, sake glass number 3 has definitely got the most acidity, and sake glass number 1 is lower in acidity overall. That being said, again, it's very, very, very tight range here. None of these sakes are going to fall into that high acid content. Only sakes that are made using Yamahai and Kimoto techniques, or sakes that have intentionally had additional lactic acid added, are going to be in that higher acidity range. So for me, in terms of acidity, sake glasses number 1 and 2 are in that low range, and sake glass number 3 is starting to tweak into that medium range. But they're very, it's just a slight difference there. So coming into intensity and flavors, you're going to sort of measure intensity somewhat the same way that you will with the nose. You know, which sake has the most driving impact when you taste it?
Number 1.
I think number 1 is pretty intense. Yeah. Number 3 is an interesting one because it has some unusual things going on with it. It doesn't have nearly the range of fruit and flowers, but it has a little bit of other things going on that are, we'll talk a bit more in detail when we get there.
Would we be able to know the name of the sake?
Yeah, I'm going to show you them all. We're just tasting blind for a second so that you guys can kind of get through and calibrate. But yeah, I'll show you all in the PowerPoint. We'll get through them. The body of the sake is going to be connected to the viscosity. So coming back to this here, you know, all the first 2 sakes here are pretty much medium in terms of their viscosity and their body. I think the sake number 3, though, is starting to get on the lighter side. It's a little bit lighter in body, and the viscosity is not nearly as notable there. Quite dry, and it's very almost watery in the mouth. Now, in wine, we tend to educate that the the palate only tastes, sweet, sour, salty, bitter, umami, and whatever the tastes are, and that everything that you're tasting, all the descriptors are being told to you by the nose. And the science of that is true. A lot of people are taught through different organizations that, like, when they're writing a tasting note, that they want to match everything that they say in the nose to what they're getting on the palate, because the palate's not telling them anything new. Where sake becomes a bit different, and I think is pretty fascinating, is that sake has lots of aroma compounds that are highly volatilized by temperature. So as soon as you put the sake in your mouth and your mouth starts to warm it up, you start to volatilize esters that send more messages back to your nose to say, oh my gosh, I'm tasting this, I'm tasting this, I'm tasting this. So where, like with sake number 1, when we were smelling it, and then tasting it, the flavor and the aroma don't quite match, because you're getting all this retroolfactory stuff happening. So I tend to, Jenna got kicked out. Oh, attendees. Thank you. Did not have that up to get that. Thank you. Tara's my new assistant. It's awesome. So when you're writing down the flavors and the intensity and sort of giving some, consideration to that, I often find that I taste more than what I just smell in sake, way more than what I do with other beverages. And so I think the tasting portion is important. So you guys can kind of take your time and write down a little bit about what you're tasting. We'll come back to the other two here, but there's definitely more of that floral and fruit stuff going on, but I'm starting to get a little bit more of that sort of ricey richness, a little more of that confected note. It's really a very delicious sake in glass number 1. So then we come to texture, and I think a lot of us will have different sort of opinions here, but many sakes will be described as light. Some will be, particularly aged sakes or very sweet sakes, can be a bit more on the dense and heavy side. I think if you're in this sort of smooth, soft, light character here, for number 1, you're in a pretty good place. If anybody got a twinge of sharpness, there is a tiny little bit of phenolic bitterness in this sake, not enough to be considered a fault. But it's certainly not heavy, right? I wouldn't call it rough. Umami is then an unusual thing. We almost never talk about umami in wine, even though it's there. Umami in wine is very frequently covered up by other things, in components in the wine. But certain wines, particularly made from extremely ripe grapes, can have tremendous umami, and that can lend to long finishes in some wines. In sake and in Japanese cuisine, umami is best described as sort of a spreading deliciousness. It's a way that the tongue responds to food that tastes good. We sometimes Americans will try to describe it as earthy, and I think occasionally that's because we use the suggestion that people taste a raw mushroom and then put that mushroom and roast it or put it in the microwave. The difference between a raw and a cooked mushroom, it shows the illustration of umami. But mushrooms are earthy, and they're not the only thing that's high in umami. Many aged cheeses, fish oils, very ripe tomatoes have very high umami, spreading deliciousness. So I often like to tell people, buy a tomato at the grocery store that was grown in the Southern Hemisphere or something like that, and ripened in routes. It tends to be mealy and sort of flavorless. And you compare that to your tomato that you grew in your garden or something that was grown by a local farmer. It's a very different experience. And that's almost a better, I think, explanation of umami. All sakes tend to have some level of umami. In some, it's quite strong, and in others, it is a little bit more delicate. And generally, the more the rice is polished for the sake, generally speaking, the higher the grade, the lower the umami characteristics are, because that umami comes from the breakdown of proteins in the rice, which are generally on the outer bands or outer layers of the rice. So thinking about that spreading deliciousness, if you want to just taste through, again, sakes number 2 and then 3. The way that sake glass number 3 spreads across the palate, I mean, there is a lot of stuff going on. There's a tremendous amount of umami in that sake. Coming back, sake glass number 2, much lower in perceived umami. Sake number 3, or number 1 rather, I think is kind of in the middle. It actually has quite a good bit of umami. I think it has to do with the length of fermentation here. So, you know, you can come up with a descriptor here. To me, you know, sake glass number 3 is where we start getting into ample umami. Sake glass number 2 is a bit more of that light or maybe mild umami. The umami in sake glass number 1 is more of that complex umami, like it's that creeps up on you kind of umami. You're like, wow, it's like really, really delicious. All of these, the alcohol is closer to medium. I think sake glass number 3 starts to get a little bit lighter. We noticed it was lighter in body and lighter in viscosity. It's still pretty dry. So I think it might be actually just a little bit lighter in alcohol. I'm not 100% sure of the specs, but that's going to be my guess. And then we come out to the total complexity of the sake. And this complexity here is relatable to the complexity in the nose. So if you found the sake was relatively complex in the aroma characteristics, and there's a lot you can say about it, then you would consider it to be complex, even in the mouth. Then we come to length or finish. And I think finish is one of the hardest parts to dial in for sake because several things can happen. And I always have to emphasize this, you know, we talk about wine and we say the longer the finish, as long as it's not a flawed finish, generally speaking, that's an aspect of quality, right? So if you have 2 Chardonnays made from the same region in the same year with, you know, similar techniques, and one has a longer finish than the other, that would be a hallmark of quality for that Chardonnay compared to the other. The problem is with sake is that the length of that finish is not always the measurement of the quality. Sometimes it's extremely short finish was the style that they were going for. And that's a very, very high quality sake. There's a lot of those Niigata sakes, again, that magical water with alcohol in it, you know, they just finish like this. And it's extremely difficult to make that type of sake. And it can be very, very high quality. And then you have other sakes that, you know, the flavors don't last very long, but then you have that lingering umami. Like I'm still having a bit of that umami character in my mouth from sake glass number 1, but the fruit flavors are gone, the other aromas are gone. So what you're really looking at in terms of length is how long do the actual flavors of that sake last? And the time frame for short, medium, and long is shorter for sake than for wine. So if you're thinking about the clock, you know, we normally think about wine that, you know, if the wine's finish is longer than, let's say, you know, 30 seconds, maybe 45 seconds, you're starting to get into that long finish, right? Maybe up to a minute and more. 30 seconds to maybe 20 seconds or so is more in the middle. And then really short is that, you know, 1 to 20 seconds. With sake, you know, you're almost usually invariably no longer than about 30 seconds on the actual finish of a sake. If it's a dessert style sake or you know, an aged sake, sometimes that can be different. It'll have a long finish like a sherry or something. But most of these fresh young sakes have a very short finish compared to wine. So that's why I say take it to a different spectrum If your finish is lasting longer than 30 seconds in sake, that's a very long finish. You have certain sakes where it's just a couple seconds and it's done, and that can still be very high quality. Yeah, I agree that there's a short finish on number 2. Let's just quickly talk about aromas and flavors in sake glass number 2. Does anybody notice where this one is in the middle here? You know, sake glass number 1 was pretty high toned, lots of floral and fruit. This one has some, but it also has a little bit more of that ricey kind of cereal character, right? Do you guys taste that? Like, especially in the finish, like it's got this a little bit more, like it tastes like the rice that it was made from. Honey Nut Cheerios, some Eric, that's great. Yeah, I totally see that. That is a great descriptor. I wish it was on here. It has a, there's also in the nose a lot more of an herbaceous character in this sake to me. It's got a little bit more of that grassiness. Does anybody want to add to that? Does anybody get anything else unusual? The fruit here to me is not quite as tropical as sake number 1. Sake number 1 was like lychee, you know, and bananas and just really strong. Here, I'm getting a little bit more of that like pear and apple. A lot of like honeydew melon kind of note almost. It still has banana, but it's not as strong. Definitely a short finish here, and a very clean kind of cut finish on here. And that's a hallmark of where this sake comes from, actually. Sort of interesting for this one. Let's come back to sake glass number 3, and then I'll flip up my PowerPoint and sort of reveal everything to you guys. I think hopefully you all feel pretty confident in using this form. As we taste moving forward, I'm going to give you guys a few minutes to run through them and make notes, and then I'll have you guys share the notes with everyone, and we'll kind of have some discussions. I'm also going to give you guys some things to look for in our future tastings, because I want you all to sort of identify some of the things we've been talking about in the lecture. So what do we think of sake glass number 3? It's really different, right?
Very dry.
It's very, very dry. So this is again where this trick of placing your hand on top of the glass and giving a swirl and bringing it up to the nose can help, especially if you're looking for any of the floral or fruit character. Interestingly, I think the more that this is aerated, the more earthy, mineral, ricey notes start to shine. There's almost like a dried apple chip thing happening. Like the fruit's there, but it's just like not fresh at all. Milka, thank you. Yeah, I really like this trick for capturing aromas. So, you know, we have that wet leaves and sort of wet fall morning. We're having some of those kind of crisp fall mornings here now. I definitely get mushroom, I get rice. Totally different type of sake here. All right, let's pull up my presentation and we'll reveal everything to you guys and move forward. What I can do too is if you guys email me back and you're interested, I'll send you all links to the tech data on all of the sakes. So maybe make notes to like which bottles were your favorites. And that way you can keep some of the specs. So sake number 1 is a Junmai Daiginjo. It's produced by Nambubiji, a very famous producer in Iwate. You see the sake meter value here is +4, so it's a little bit on the drier side, but it's so fruity in style that it comes across, particularly compared to some like sake glass number 3, as being a more fruity, sweet style of sake. This sake is named Shinpaku, again, the white heart, and they have this gorgeous washi paper label here that has sort of emerged. This is meant to be like a cross section of the rice. So you can see the white heart and the husk around it, but it's also a play on the Enzo symbol, sort of this circle that people who practice calligraphy in Japan will practice over and over. A sort of a Zen symbol. Circle can sort of hold everything or hold nothing. This is a sake that is made with Mieri yeast, which is a really new modern yeast that is known for producing very high aromatics. So that's why you were getting those soaring tones of like tropical fruit and that really high, that notable licoricey note, that anise character on this sake. Sake number 2 comes from Niigata. So somebody was commenting on how it had this very short, light finish. That is a hallmark of sakes produced in Niigata, Japan. This is a unique sake because it is one of the only sakes that is USDA certified as organic. They actually, in order to do this, for a long time, grew the rice in the United States and then sent it back to Japan to make the sake and then ship the sake back to the United States. So they completely messed up their carbon footprint with that, I think. But they developed a relationship with the USDA and they're now able to grow the akirakomachi in Niigata themselves. So that they've achieved a great relationship there. This is a sake that is so light in character, in part because of the water source here. Only a small degree of difference here in the SMV value, but we did see a little difference in sweetness, I think, between sake glass number 1 and sake glass number 2. And then the last one here is a Junmai. So this is from Nihon Sakari. So basically what we were doing here was just tasting down the pyramid, right? So we had Junmai Daiginjo, Junmai Ginjo, and a Junmai. And this is very Junmai in style. Note the ABV here is a little lower than that 15%. It's really kind of notable when we taste it here. The burn on the alcohol is a little stronger in sake glass number 1 in particular. And I think that it's interesting to note here because this sake comes across as so dry. And they don't reveal it on here, but there is a bit of higher acidity happening. They don't reveal their rice, they just call it regular rice. So it's sort of funny that I came up with the name calling it sakamai, meaning like sake rice, but they actually are using just basic table rice in order to make this. And the label here is essentially using the kanji for rice in order to make up their label. But Junmai sake tends to be earthy, it tends to be ricey, it tends to benefit greatly from being warmed. And note here that it's only polished to 75%. So again, there is no rice polish ratio here. So where Honjosa, they polish it down to 70, here they've only gone down to 75. Yeah, I agree with you, Mokwer, that the aroma and flavor really do mess up my perception of that. And that's why the SMV is really considered a loose interpretation because again, it's really a measure of specific gravity if we're being accurate. I think that where it starts to become more extreme, it becomes more helpful. So when you start getting above, +4, +5, when you start getting below -4, -7, you start seeing a much bigger spectrum. The driest sakes that are available commercially go up to about +15. They're pretty hard to get. There are a few that are more common that maybe +7, +6 we start to see. Most sake falls in between +4 and -4 in the sake meter value as an average. Interestingly, that number can get very low. So there are sweet sakes out there that are like -70. So we're going to jump into the history. This is where you may want to open up your textbook and make notes along with it. So we're going to start on page 2 of the textbook if you want to highlight in here the things that I comment on or that maybe are highlighted in bold or in red. For the rest of the next day and a half that we do this, we'll be going along with this. So I mentioned earlier that humans love alcohol. So as soon as we learn how to plant stuff, we learn how to make it into alcohol. So as soon as rice cultivation became a thing in Japan, basically people figure out how to turn it into alcohol. There was a first written message about alcoholic beverages being enjoyed in Japan in a Chinese record book, the Book of Wei. And basically they said that Japanese people like to drink a lot and dance at weddings and funerals. I think we all kind of turned to the bottle at those times. So I thought that was kind of funny. So this is going all the way back to the 3rd century. But what's particularly important to note is when really sake being noted as an alcoholic beverage produced from rice, what came along much later. So this was during the 8th century. There was a period of time where certain areas of Japan were asked to keep records for 20 years about their culture, what they grew, how did they celebrate, what were their holidays, all of these things. So it was at that time in the Fudoki that the idea that sake was first produced or with rice was actually written down. Before koji was used, sake was made by chewing the rice and then spitting it into a vessel. Your mom might have told you to chew your food well before you swallowed. It's because we have diastic enzymes in our saliva that begin our digestive process. So just by chewing the rice, the enzymes in your saliva would start to break those down. You would spit that into a vessel, and over time, the diastic enzymes would create sugar, and then ambient yeast in the air would get into that and begin to ferment that yeast into alcohol. There was a long period of time where sake was really only produced as something to be offered to the gods. It was used in temples and in shrines, and essentially the people that were thought to be pure enough to make sake were prepubescent virginal girls. There's actually a really interesting anime called Your Name that came out a few years ago. It unseated Spirited Away as the most beloved anime of all time in Japanese history. I recommend you check it out because they actually have a young lady in that movie who makes kuchikame no sake in the movie. And I freaked out in the movie theater when I was watching it. I was like, I'm the only person here that knows what's happening right now, and it's super cool. So that's mouth chew sake. I took this picture in Shimane Prefecture, and this is a tiny little unkempt shrine where it was written in their Fudoki in that area that the gods first shared sake with man. So this place, this shrine was erected as sort of the place that gods brought sake to man, and this was written in the Fudoki of that area's time. And so I thought that was really, really cool to take this picture here. And this was associated with the sake taisha in the same area here, not far from Izumo. And this gentleman here, this older man, was the 16th generation of his family to be taking care of this shrine. So I thought that was really interesting because it was just like years and years, hundreds of years of his family that were dedicated. The sake taisha, there are many different sake taishas around Japan, but it's basically where farmers and fishermen will go to pray for their yield. So it's hard to see, but behind him in this picture is a large taru of sake, a big cask here. So this takes us to the Edo period, and this is that period of time where lots and lots of changes happen that are still a part of sake brewing today. So the first thing that started to happen was that they started to reduce the amount of koji that they were incorporating into the sake, which meant that the sake was a little bit less sweet. They also started to figure out ways of removing more of the kasu, making the sake clearer. It was around this time as well that they started to employ carbon filtration. And there's a really fun myth where they talk about a brewery worker who was fired from his job at a brewery. And brewing tanks of sake look white. And he decided that he was going to turn the sake black. So he went back in the middle of the night and dumped a bunch of ash and soot from the fireplace into the vats of fermenting sake, thinking, ha ha ha, I got you, your sake is all gonna be black. And when the workers came back the next day, because of the ionic pull of the carbon, it had attached and to all of the stuff floating in the sake and dropped it all down to the bottom. And that's where they say that the use of activated carbon became common. Again, 400 years ago, really, when they were starting to do this. So very, very long time. That is unfortunately a myth. I so much want that story to be true. It's still a fun story to share with people, though, if you're ever talking to them. This ended up leading to the term sumi sake, meaning clear sake, and seishu. Seishu is a particularly important word because it's interchangeable with the term nihonshu. And seishu, or clear sake, is the legal sort of term used to define sake in Japan. It's also important to note that sake had kept its borders shut to external visitors and trade until the middle of the 19th century. This is one of the reasons why so many of the traditions of Japan were so beautifully kept for such a long time. Why people are so attached to their prefectures and the history from where they come from. And in many ways, why the society of Japan is so homogenized as over 98% Japanese. It was around this time that a lot of changes happened in Japanese society. And there were lots of things that they were doing in sake production that had not been proven by Western science, that once they had that technology, by the turn of the 20th century, it just lightning shot the technology in sake production. So that brings us to the Meiji period. So this major time of change. And it was at this time that Nihonshu was first brought to the world. So sake made its debut at the Vienna International Exposition in 1873, called the Japanese alcohol, Japanese sake. When you're looking here at the slides, you see Nihon, again, the land of the rising sun. This is the origin of the sun, Japan. This is the kanji for alcohol. And the left side here of the kanji is part of a kanji that was meant for like a rice slurry. And then this central part here on the right, it almost looks like a medicine bottle, was part of the kanji for medicine. So if you think about it, like a medicinal slurry of rice is kind of where this symbol comes from. But this actually is just generally the symbol for alcohol in Japan. So sometimes if you're going around Japan, you'll see a sign like this and it's above a bar or it's above a liquor shop. They're not just selling sake, they're selling beer and all kinds of spirits. When you see Nihonshu though, you know that that is sake made in Japan, made from rice. Moving forward, here's where we start to get into that classification system for taxation that caused a lot of problems. So I showed you guys the chart where the top 10 producers by volume of sake in Japan have more than 50% of the market share. This happened because of what was called Kyubetsu Seido. So basically toward the end of World War II, Japan realized that they really needed a lot of money. They were like, well, we can tax alcohol and we can make money, and we're going to tax it based on what we call the grade of the sake. The problem is that people who had deep pockets could buy up the grade. So if you had a larger brewery with a lot of money, you could basically pay off the tax man and he'd say, oh, you've got really, really great sake. Whereas you might be a tiny little family owned and operated brewery. You don't have a lot of money to pay your taxes. You're making literal nectar of the gods, but they're like, that's only so-so because you can't pay your taxes. So Kibetsu Seido was established at this time. It was revised a few times, but it took until 1992, if you can believe it, for them to actually abolish this program. So there were decades of time where these, deep-pocketed breweries grew and kind of became the flagships of Japanese sake. And a lot of the other, thousands of smaller breweries really, really struggled. At this time is when they decided that the current way of ranking the sake or grading the sake would be based on the seimai and whether or not alcohol is added. So this is where those charts that we were looking at earlier come into play. They still tax sake for alcohol by volume, but it's no longer related to the actual grade. It was here at this time as well that we started to see the explosion of ginjo and daiginjo sake. I always pause here because there was an economic bubble period that basically burst sort of in the mid 80s, late 80s in Japan. And there was a time that a lot of Japanese left and they set up businesses in the United States. And just to note, that Kibetsu Seido system wasn't abolished until 1992. If you're a family from Japan that came during that time, your impression of what sake was in the 80s may not have very much relationship to what's actually being made now. I often would talk to my sales team in North Carolina about this. Like when you go into a restaurant and they're, maybe an older Japanese family is running it, the sake of the 80s in Japan is not the same as the sakes of today. So it's really fascinating what a new beverage it is. The term jizake, meaning regional or craft sake, was born at this time. And there was also a term maboroshi no sake or phantom sake, which is still used today, basically to describe sake that is extremely popular but impossible to get. It sells out immediately. There's articles about different types of phantom sakes still being sought after in Japan today. So we then get to the Heisei period, and one of the most important things that developed at this time, it's like unicorn wine, exactly. Elias asked, why the sudden change? What was this question about? Elias, do you want to explain your question? I missed you.
Yeah, what pushed them to change the style of making sake?
So the main thing that happened was that in the earlier part of the 20th century, they invented the rice polishing machine. So we'll talk more about that later on, but basically the vertical rice polishing machine that allowed them to polish away smoothly so many more layers of the rice is what led to the ginjo boom. And then, this exploration for moving forward. But as I mentioned, Japan had its borders closed and they had all these sort of long-standing traditional practices. People clung to that for a while. And then the National Research Institute of Brewing was established, and they started doing all kinds of experiments, sort of proving things. Why does the Kimoto method work? Do we have to do the Kimoto method? Can we do this? Can we do that? And a lot of their research is what, right around like the 1919, really earlier, 1909, 1910, moving into 1933, when that rice polishing machine was invented, was a huge catalyst on changing the style of sake. There was also just some of the long-standing effects of the World War that also affected it as well, the rice shortage. There were a number of things historically that kind of go beyond the syllabus of today's class, but that essentially was this sort of opening of the doors proving the science behind sake production and then finding ways to improve it is sort of what led to the major change in style. So moving into this modern era, Japan started to recognize how important their sake culture was, and that, you know, sake is a beverage that's intended to be enjoyed like a wine. It has intense regional characteristics. So there were lots of places that started to develop terms and places for GIs, or geographical indication. So geographical indication is a protected term by the World Trade Organization. And the main thing that they look at here is that it actually has a specific area. It doesn't necessarily have to be a political boundary. It can just be a geography around maybe a water source or a mountain or a certain community. And then that they have a regional quality standard that they must meet in order to make sake that comes from that region. Generally, too, they have to have a governing body. So the GIs for sake started to develop 2005. The first was Hakusan in Ishikawa. Real important one to me is that in 2015, Nihonshu became a GI. So as a category, you know, you can only call Nihonshu if it's sake made in Japan. Somebody making sake in the United States cannot call it Nihonshu. So that's pretty significant. Later came Yamagata, and some areas in Hyogo are becoming more and more identified as well, along with Mie Prefecture. This took us to 2019, more recent period, and the launch of the Reiwa period. So this was an extremely unusual sort of moment of change where Emperor Akihito started to become older. He felt unable to fulfill his duties as emperor, and he abdicated the throne to his son. So this launched the Reiwa period. I put the kanji for Reiwa, Rei meaning order or auspiciousness, and Wa meaning peace or harmony. This is a yeah. Oh, thank you. Everybody's having internet issues today. I'm glad I'm not the only one. So Reiwa is a made up word. The Reiwa is not a term that is, you know, commonly used in Japanese language. They actually took the kanji from a poem and linked them together, and pretty much all of the eras in Japan have been named in a similar fashion. So they launched this new era here, the Reiwa period, with this linking of these two kanji. This idea of like auspicious harmony, or I think, you know, order and harmony together was sort of hard for people to imagine, like, is it forced or, you know, forced peace? But it's sort of a fantastical name or proprietary name for the new era. Of course, this was celebrated with sake, and lots of people wanted to be the first to produce sake within that brewing year that was connected to the launch of the Reiwa era, which would be considered year one. So there are you know, sakes out there that were brewed in 2019, and it looks like they were brewed in 2001, or you might see like 01 as the year. It wasn't from 2001. That's actually from the first year of the Reiwa period. So we know that sake is embraced around the world. The love of it has spread beyond Japan. And of course, there are people getting certified in sake, which is awesome. So we imagine this to grow quite far into the future. I mentioned seishu earlier as the official description of sake, quite important to note. And again, this is according to Japanese Liquor Tax Act. These are the things that they monitor. So it has to have alcohol. It has to be made with rice koji, and water, and it has to be pressed. Now, it doesn't mean that it has to be completely filtered, right? So nigori sake, cloudy sake, has been lightly filtered. At least what this is telling you is that at least some of the solids have to be removed in order to call it seishu or clear sake. It's important to not confuse this Liquor Tax Act with the liquor business trade union laws that manage all of the labeling terms. So in 1992, they separated out the taxation and grading. Grading became officiated by the Business Trade Union for liquor. And then the Tax Act covered this alcohol. And basically for every % of alcohol that the sake contains, the tax goes up. So we're gonna get into water. So water that is used at a brewery is called shuzo yosui. And I mentioned earlier, this is 80% of the volume of sake on average. We know that most breweries are located near their own special quality water source. There is so much water used in sake production, it's pretty amazing. We'll talk about how it's categorized here moving forward. But understand, so shuzo is a term for a brewery or a brewing company. So like it's not quite, because it technically means brewery, but you'll see things like the brewery Asahi Shuzo makes Kubota sake, the brand. So when you see shuzo, it's basically a term meaning the brewer, the producer, the production of sake. They use about 20 times the total volume of the sake that they make, or 20 times the brewing water than the actual amount of the final sake. And when they start getting up into higher grades, they use even more, 50 times as much total water than the actual ginjo sake that's produced. This is water that's used for soaking rice, washing rice, cleaning equipment, you know, anything you can imagine using water for. But they separate out the water for what they actually use to brew and make the sake to other things like bottling that they're doing at the brewery. Someone's asking if water is the terroir. Book says 80% of total volume of rice. I wonder if that's been updated. What page am I on? Yeah, they did. They updated it to the rice. Okay. Thank you. Let me highlight this. Sorry, guys, this book was just updated and I spent the whole weekend updating the PowerPoint and I didn't realize that that terminology was updated. That's probably updated because of the JSR. So, okay, let me come back. So in the terms, we did the sei mai buai. Sei mai buai is the rice polishing ratio. Buai is a ratio. So I need to update the terminology in here to match the book. So basically what they're saying is 20 times the total amount of rice, 50 times as much as the total amount of rice. Almost all of the buais, all of the ratios are based on the total amount of rice that was used to make a volume of sake. And that's the original amount of the weight of the rice that's used. So they use these ratios to decide what % of that rice became koji, what % of that rice was just put into the mash, what % of the rice went into shubo, what % went into additions to build the moromi. They even have ratios for the amount of kasu that is pressed out of a sake. The amount of leaves that are pressed out of a sake. So yeah, I think that they just upgraded the language here on page 5 to be a little bit more accurate for this class. So thank you for pointing that out to me. I just need to update this here. So yeah, technically this is about the ratio of rice that's used. So 20 times more water than rice for basic sake, 50 times more water than rice for ginjo grade. I think just noting this 20 and 50 will help you on the exam. I need to make a note about that. Okay. So the water is divided into these categories. Jozo means brewing, and binzume means bottling. So there's water for the brewing and there's water for the bottling. So again, jozo meaning sake brewing. This is the water that is really got to be careful in its content of minerals. You can't have anything damaging to the sake, and you want to make sure there's at least something beneficial to help keep the yeast active. Yeast cannot live on sugar alone. They kind of need to take their vitamins in order to do a good job. The reason why certain sakes have, with harder water, have a more ricey, earthy, almost as the book says, masculine characteristic, is because the minerals in the water invigorate the yeast, give them more vitamins in order to produce more alcohol more quickly. The book breaks down these additional terms. I will let you know you don't need to memorize all of these additional terms, but this is, again, the water that would be used for washing and soaking, actually used for brewing, for making the shubo. It's water that's added. Technically, the water that's added for diluting the sake would be the same water source as the Jozo Yosui, but it's categorized differently. And then anything else, they always have this sort of other purposes, the zatsuyo, zatsume kind of thing. The water for bottling, bin means bottle. So if you can remember that bin means bottle and that Jozo means brewing, you'll get these questions right. Thinking too about Jozo alcohol is added as like brewing alcohol to add alcohol. Jozo Yosui is brewing water. And then bin meaning bottling. Here again, we have these three groups, and wari mizu is a really important term. This is the water that's added to dilute the sake to reduce the alcohol by volume. It's important to note, though, that this is not water that comes out of the faucet. This is the same water that's used for the brewing. It's just categorized because this happens closer to the time of bottling. It comes after the brewing is complete, if that makes sense. Many breweries will be, attached to their local water source with pipes for the cleaning and the washing, the using a shower to do pasteurization, for instance, or soaking bottles for pasteurization. But the water for the brewing is going to come from that artisanal well source. It might even have been brought to the brewery from outside of the brewery. There are many breweries that will go and get wari mizu from the spring in the mountains outside Nara, and they will bring it back by truck to their brewery and store it in tanks. So they'll have tanks of their brewing water, and then they'll have the local water source for all of the binzume yosui, if that makes sense. Does everybody understand that the wari mizu is the special water for brewing, but it falls under the bottling time because of when it happens? I just want to make sure people aren't confused by that, because I've had a lot of people ask me about clarifying that in the past. So what are the components of Jozo Yosui that they're looking for? So again, you want these beneficial minerals. So potassium, phosphorus, and magnesium are really the most primary ones. Sometimes a little bit of nitrogen is there. What's most important, though, is that the water be free of iron and manganese. And Japan has some of the most strict water quality standards in the world for their water, even for their drinking water. And so it's already very low for drinking water, and it's even lower for the sake brewing water. Really nice way of remembering this is because you don't want to confuse magnesium and manganese. If you notice you have iron and man here, just remember Iron Man is bad for sake, and you'll easily remember that these are the two detrimental elements for sake. So this brings us to hard and soft water. And I mentioned earlier that, really all the water of Japan can be considered pretty soft, but it's on sort of a shorter scale there. You're going to want to make sure you know that calcium and magnesium are the minerals that are measured in order to determine the hardness of water. And there are two main systems. There's the German system and the American system. Japan uses the German system in order to figure out how hard the water is. We have been talking as a team a lot about this language with masculine and feminine, and I just want to acknowledge that I don't feel like it's very 21st century language or very politically correct, but it's terminology that's used in Japan and recognized by the Sake Service Institute as a way to distinguish between sakes that are brewed with hard or soft water. So we will use those terms, and I hope that it doesn't offend anybody. But just as a general rule, again, because harder water has higher content of minerals, it invigorates the rice, or sorry, it invigorates the yeast, and the rice then melts faster, breaks down more, releases more protein into the sake, which becomes more glutamic acids. There's more umami. You tend to get more savory and more ricey character, sometimes even more mineral or earthy character from the water itself in sakes produced with hard water. And so these are considered masculine characteristics. Soft water, being very low in minerals, is going to end up either being extremely light and clean, or even just round and soft and almost voluptuous in the mouth. So this is the chart that's in your book. The three main areas that we're going to talk about are the Miyamizu from Nara, the Gokosui from Kyoto in the Fushimi district, and then Fukuryusui from Shizuoka around the area of Mount Fuji, this being really the softest. The Tokyo tap water here is at 5.5 degrees hardness. Most of American water is closer to this hard category here. Pretty much all of Japan's water is in this sort of light hard and down. So you notice it's pretty low on the spectrum. And this is an image from the shrine where the Gokosui was found. We'll look at that again later. So I mentioned earlier that Japan is quite wet. The average is about 60 inches of rain per year. And again, these are the main water sources that we're going to discuss. We'll grab bottles to taste here in a moment. Shizuoka here is where Mount Fuji is located. And again, this is where the Fukuryusui is found. Fukuryusui technically means mountain spring water. It's not necessarily, it doesn't really mean water from Mount Fuji. So I want to emphasize that. There are other breweries that will say, other places in Japan that say they have Fukuryusui, but this is just an example of that. But Gokosui and Miyamizu are very specific, only found in these areas. They were specifically named waters. So just to illustrate the water sources in terms of their hardness and the rainfall or water in Japan, I use this map to kind of help you all see. So notice that about a third of Japan gets above 80 inches of water. It's pretty heavy. And then, you know, again, average being around 60. Hyogo here, because the Shikoku Island takes the brunt of most of the moisture coming in off of the Pacific, and they're blocked by this mountain range here, they tend to have a little bit harder water here. They get lighter rainfall. They're more in that 40 to 60 range. And this is where the Miyamizu comes from. Coming into Kyoto, where just sort of on the other side of these mountains here, they get a whole lot more rain. And a lot of the water is filtered down through the mountains coming up through these springs, and it tends to be very, very soft and round and voluptuous. And then you have the area around Mount Fuji where you both get a lot of rain, and you also have that volcanic soil that everything is filtered down through, and it just comes out of the ground, you know, really, 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 really soft. Is it getting drier or wetter in Japan? I think it's getting wetter in Japan. They've had a lot of they've been getting hit in the same way that the Southeast here, we have a lot of hurricanes. They get major typhoon seasons, and they've had some really bad typhoons the last several years. They keep getting worse. Lots of mudslides and flooding, and it's been pretty devastating. So southern Japan, and then along that sort of southern coast there of southern Honshu can usually get hit pretty hard. So let's talk about Miyamizu. Miyamizu basically means shrine water. And essentially there was a gentleman who was making sake around the end of the Edo period. And he had two different breweries, and he was making sake in the same style, but the sakes turned out completely differently from one another. So he conducted an experiment, and he brought water back from Nishinomiya to his other brewery, and he ended up realizing that it was the water from Nishinomiya that made the difference. So Miyamizu is a little higher in minerals. It, as I said, invigorates the yeast. It helps to give nutrients to the koji. Everything is sort of activated right from the beginning by using Miyamizu, and you end up having this sort of stronger, richer character in the sake. Miyamizu is one of those waters that people will purchase and bring by tank to their brewery and hold in tanks. Its development was so famous that it developed into the development of what are called mizuya or mizu stores, where people would buy water to use at their breweries. So this was a big change. Can Americans brew in Japan? Yeah, Americans can brew in Japan. You can actually go and visit breweries and you can get jobs. It's pretty interesting. There are lots of people who are getting involved. There's actually a very famous Brit who produces sake in Japan. Little memory thing here, thinking of Miyamizu beginning with an M and it produces masculine sake. It might be a helpful thing for you to remember. So this brings us to Goko Sui. This is the honorable aromatic water of Fushimi. So this is an area of many shrines. Kyoto was once the capital of Japan. And there was a wellspring that was discovered inside of a shrine. Again, the Gokonomiya shrine, beautiful shrine that you can still visit. And it was declared honorable aromatic water. It's one of the top ranking waters of Japan. And because the water is so low in minerals, it has this sort of round, almost sweet, fresh character. It's thought to make feminine sake. So Fushimi is feminine, or Goko Sui is girly. You can kind of think of those as some study hints to help you if you get a question about that. This again is the entrance to Gokonomiya. You can see all the water here sort of noted in the picture, like underneath the shrine and spilling out the well springs. People actually bring water bottles to Gokonomiya and you can just fill them from the spring. So the water is potable right out of the ground. So this comes to Fukuru Yusui, kind of an unpronounceable word, but again, that mountain spring water from Mount Fuji. If you look for the FU here in Fukuru Yusui and remember Mount Fuji, you should be able to identify which this water is. Again, the snow and rain that comes down all across Mount Fuji comes through the volcanic soils, and it ends up having this perfect ratio of calcium and magnesium. It's incredibly soft and makes this a very delicate, light style of sake, very similar in many ways to the snowmelt that's used in Niigata. And I actually visited, there's a famous shrine right at the base of Mount Fuji where people who came from the capital when it was in Kyoto, this is now considered the back entrance to Mount Fuji because people come down from Tokyo. But if you come from Kyoto and go up, this Fujisan Sengan Taisha was where people would bathe in the waters of Mount Fuji to cleanse themselves before they would hike up for New Year's and other times of year. And you can just see the water rushing down from the mountain here. This is Fukuru Yusui. All right, so you need the next 3 bottles, and we're gonna pour and taste real quick. And I'm gonna grab mine. All right, so you guys should have bottles 4, 5, and 6. Take a moment and go through your tasting on your own. You can go ahead and taste through all 3. One of the sakes is made with miyomizu, that little bit more mineral-driven water. One of them is made with water that's very similar to gokosui, the water of Fushimi, very soft, very round. And then one of the sakes is made with snow melt, and this is not included in the text. But again, it's very similar to the style of water that you would get in that Fukuryu Sui, that extremely, extremely light style of water. What I'm hoping that you'll look for here is that one of these sakes is a little bit earthier, a little bit more minerally, a little bit more ricey. One of the sakes is rounder, sweeter, very feminine in style, and one is like magical water with alcohol in it. So the main thing I want you guys to get out of this is which one is magical water with alcohol in it, which one is a bit more minerally, and which one is that sort of sweeter, rounder character, because this is all coming from the water in these sakes. So take a moment and taste through. I want to give you guys enough time to do complete notes, but we've run into a little bit of time constraints, mostly because of my computer problems, and I apologize. So take a few minutes to sort of speed taste through, and then I'll see, maybe even can kind of put it in the chat what your thoughts are. Sake School of America has a partnership with Mutual Trading Company, and so we tend to showcase our products in this class. They're all wonderful, very high quality products. What's hard for me is that the main brewery that we work with that is from the Fushimi region makes some beautiful examples of sake, but they tend to use unusual rice strains, which deters a little bit from your ability to identify the water characteristic. So I've been trying to get permission to source sakes for this particular part of the tasting that are exact, but I think this is still a really good illustration. I love all the comments. You guys are great. So far, I think everybody agrees that sake number 6 is rounder, sweeter, right?
Yes.
One thing I'm hoping for you guys to do too, don't forget to check the color of these sakes. Sake number 2 is, or sorry, sake number 5, I should say. I always go glass 1, 2, 3. So glass number 2, sake number 5 is colorless. It's completely colorless, clear as water. Really, so is sake number 6. I'm lying to you. So is sake number 5. Sake number 6, excuse me, the third glass. When you hold that one to the light, you should see a golden color to this sake. The third glass, or sake number 6, it's got a little bit of a yellow-green color. That's a notable difference in that sake as well. Yeah, so 6 is round, soft, feminine. So, and then, am I freezing? Susie says I'm freezing. Am I coming in pretty clear to most people? I haven't had a warning right now. Okay. Good, okay. Susie, it might be your connection. I'm sorry. So let's go between sakes number 4 and 5 for a moment. This is always a bit of a stumper. Just by aroma, just by smelling sake number 4 and then sake number 5, which one has a cleaner aroma? What I mean by that is one of these sakes has earthy, mushroomy, ricey aromas. It almost smells like roasted rice to me a little bit. And then one of the sakes is like really shy in the nose, and it almost smells like, I mean, it's almost hard to tell. You know, you get a little bit of fruit in there, a little bit of floral characteristics. You might capture a little bit of this with your palm. It has almost like a bit of a mineral water characteristic, but it doesn't have the ricey earthiness of the other. A 11 new messages. Getting chatty. This is great. Four tastes ricier. Yeah, great, great. Okay, so let me bring up my PowerPoint here. We'll talk about these again. So sake number 1, this is from Hyogo and it's made with miyamizu. So the hard part, when we talk about the mineral character in miyamizu, the water itself tastes a bit like mineral water, but again, it's invigorating the fermentation, melting the rice. So the giveaway here is this, that there's both an earthy and a ricey notes in this sake because it was made through just more activated yeast. Notice it's a tokubetsu junmai. So, you know, this is made with gohyaku mangoku, which is, you know, kind of a shyer style of rice. You know, treated again the same level of care as a ginjo grade, but without the ginjo ka, without the fruity floral aroma that you get from the higher grades. The next one is from Niigata, and this is that snow melt sake. So this is that magical water with alcohol in it, what we call Niigata crisp. 15.6% alcohol. Would anybody guess when you just took a sip of that? I mean, it's so delicate. I mean, that is gonna mess you up fast. Also quite dry. It's a +6 on the sake meter value. Tons and tons of snow in the mountains of Niigata, and all of this melts and produces the water for brewing throughout the region, where they're very famous for this very light style. And again, this, when water evaporates from the ground, it doesn't bring any minerals with it. It's just pure water. It forms clouds. The ice crystals form from those clouds, forming snowflakes that fall. Snowflakes themselves are pure water. So you have very, very pure water, free of minerals, that becomes the water for brewing here. And this last one is from Born in Fukui, and they again have very similar water characteristics to the waters of Fushimi, the Gokosui. And the reason I had you guys note the color here on this bottle is because this is a Muroka sake. It's a sake that was pressed, but then had no further filtration. They basically settled the sake. They didn't do any carbon filtering or any additional filtering. And so the natural kind of golden hue of the sake itself, this actually comes from B vitamin, the B vitamin complex that's in the rice, stays behind, and you get this really pretty golden color. When sake ages, it gains color, and so a lot of breweries will sort of filter out all the color of the sake because they've been concerned for a long time that that golden hue would be perceived as the sake being old or you're too old to drink. It's become a major trend in Japan to make more and more of these unfiltered styles of sake. So it's a term to kind of keep in mind because it's really blown up. So we're going to jump into rice. So rice is a seed of the rice plant, a grass. I don't know why my mind blew when I first figured out that rice came from grass. I know that's silly, like grains come from grasses, but I don't know. I like to always emphasize that to people. It's actually a grass plant. And there are three main types of rice. So Japonica, Indica, and Javanica. You can see sort of the breakdown of what these rice grains look like. When I did some additional research on this, I mean, technically Javanica has been proven to be within the family of Japonica, but SSI still sort of divides these up. Javanica is the type of rice that would include arborio rice in Italy that's used to make risotto. Indica rice are these long grains like jasmine rice, stuff that you would see made for Thai rice, that type. Uncle Ben's in the United States, the long grain rice is indica rice. But Japonica rice is very specific. It's grown in Japan and other parts of Asia. There are a few people growing some of these rices in the United States. But it has a very, very limited amount of market share overall compared to indica. It also tends to be sticky compared to indica rice. So, when you're eating the table rice in Japan, when you think about sushi or any of these other things, the rice grains like to stick together. And this is actually something that the Japanese battle all the time in their breweries. We know that this rice originated in Southeast Asia. I'm not going to bore you with all the details of this slide, but just remember that Japonica rice came from Southeast Asia. And the rice plant itself could technically make rice over several years, but the yields go down year after year, and the quality of the rice isn't the same. So they always plant new seedlings every year. The Japonica rice has to be grown through wet rice cultivation. So basically in rice paddies like you see in the picture. Dry rice cultivation is used for indica rice and even the calrose in the United States, and it just does not provide the right amount of moisture and nutrients and other care that's needed to grow the real sake rice. It is the #1 agricultural crop of Japan. It's also regulated by the government. So one of the things that's very interesting right now that we're looking at in the industry is based on COVID. The amount of rice that's allowed to be planted is based on the amount of sake essentially that's consumed. So they measure need based on what's happening in the market. And COVID has had a real big impact on that. There's some breweries where their sales skyrocketed through retail, just like we saw with certain wine in Japan. There's others that have been just completely stymied by the closure of restaurants, just like we've seen in the on-premise in the United States. So it's going to be interesting to see what happens, after this season with the rice cultivation in Japan. This is the sort of life cycle of the vine through the growing. So the first thing that they do is they actually they sprout the seeds in greenhouses. So the seeds are allowed to germinate, and they grow in greenhouses almost like astroturf in like these squares until they're about 6 inches high. And around April, they take those seedlings and they sow them into the patties. And we all like to have these romantic, images here of everything being done by hand. But the truth is that most of the rice is automatedly planted. They actually have almost like these swimming tractors that go through these muddy fields and break up the seedlings and plant them in even lines in the patties. So they're sown into the earth, and they use flood irrigation through many patties to fill them up with water. And they monitor this and allow the plant to grow. And there's this point here, generally around August, where they take all the water out of the rice paddy for a very important reason. So just like with wine grapes, when you plant vineyards, if you allow there to be drip irrigation or lots of water on those grapevines, the roots of the grapevines will grow out and close to the surface of the earth, right? And they'll just basically go like, okay, there's water. They don't grow strong root systems that go way down into the earth. Well, the same thing is true of the rice plant. So in order to help stabilize the plants and grow stronger root systems, they drain them out so that they actually start to force those roots further down into the earth. The other thing that happens is that there's all kinds of stuff going on underneath in the water, and things that start to decompose in the water would actually eventually start to poison the plant if they weren't allowed to have contact with oxygen. So essentially they drain the water away to help those things break down in the presence of oxygen and properly decompose, creating fertilizer naturally, rather than allowing them to poison the plant. So this is called nakaboshi. This happens here. They refill up the patties and then allow these to mature. And harvest is going to happen around September. Coming back to the strength of the root system, this is actually connected to weather patterns in Japan. So just like we have hurricane season in the United States, they have typhoon season in Japan. A lot of the rice for sake takes longer to mature than table rice. So you're harvesting late into September, maybe even into early October. You run a great risk of high winds coming and blowing over your rice. So helping to secure the rice in with stronger root systems is also important for that. So shuzo kotekimai, kind of the long word here, basically means shuzo, again, coming from the idea of brewing, mai coming from the idea of rice. Shuzo kotekimai means brewing specific rice. This is also, considered sakamai. This is where you have, again, around 100 different types of rice that are cultivated in order just to help sake brewing. They are, before use, they have to be graded, classified, and certified before going to the trade. And they're very, very careful about which grades of sakes get to be used in order to make the tokute meishoshu, those specialty sakes that we looked at earlier on the charts. So the main thing that they look for, they want each grain to be large. When you compare the size of each kernel to table rice, they're much, much bigger. They have what's called a higher Senryuju, meaning the weight of 1,000 grains, is much heavier, much bigger than the weight of 1,000 grains of table rice. The kernels tend to be quite fragile and also a bit more porous, which means that they absorb water very well, which is important for the cultivation of koji. The shinpaku, that white heart that you see up here in this polished rice, again, that core of extra starch is very important. When they get down to the shinpaku, what happens is if you look at the grain itself, this brown rice here that has not yet been polished is a really great example. So this brown rice, you see where it notes that there's a germ. That's all going to get polished away. That's why earlier today I was saying that it was kind of this moment of everything kind of fitting together, understanding why we didn't make sake like beer. You polish off the germ, you polish off the ability of this rice to grow. The outer layers of this rice have proteins, lipids, fats, amino acids, all kinds of things that can cause unusual flavors and aromas in the sake. Those minerals are important to help that seed grow. They're not necessarily helpful to the flavor of the sake. There's still starch in the outer layers of the sake, of the rice, but when you get down to the middle, what happens is you have more protein and far less of, more starch and far less protein and amino acids and all of those other things that you don't want. So again, the less that they polish the rice, for like those junmai grades, you have a whole lot more of those things that cause that earthy, kind of funky characteristic in those lower grades. The closer you get to the center toward the shinpaku, the more that goes away, the more starch is present. Starch becomes pure glucose, glucose becomes pure alcohol. You get magical water with alcohol in it. One of the other characteristics that they look for is gaikonainan. Let's see here. What happens to all the polished off everything? Yeah, so Eric, that's a great question. So nothing goes to waste. All of the powder that's polished off the rice, the red powder, the brown stuff from the outer layers gets sent off to feed cattle and pigs. And then the white powder gets sent off to be made into rice crackers. It can also be sent and be distilled into vinegar. So there's a lot of food product that are made with the powders. So gaikonainan means, essentially it's like Japanese for al dente. It's kind of the best way for me to describe it. But it means that the rice has been steamed to a place where it's tender, but not sticky. So it's firm on the outside, but tender on the inside. And almost, the rice that's steamed for sake production almost feels like tiny little rubber beads. Like you press on them and they'll give and then they'll kind of bounce back. So that's gaikonainan. Really important because you're going to inoculate this with koji. You don't want a tremendous amount of moisture on the outside. You want the koji to look for the moisture and the starch on the inside of the rice. So gaikonainan is a really integral part of rice. Here's some comparisons between table foods. So we have Yamada Nishiki here. You see it has this really prominent white heart here, the shinpaku, but nipponbare, which is a table rice, does not. Here again, you can see polished rice showing off the shinpaku. I mentioned earlier that there's a crack inside the shuzo kotekimai that helps refract the light, which you can really see here where, again, the rice is solid all the way through, but when you get to this white core of starch, you're seeing it because light is refracted inside the rice, and it's showing you that through this crack. And the nipponbare does not have the same crack. So the way that this is cultivated, there are a few things that are interestingly similar to wine production. So one is a wide diurnal temperature range. The days need to be warm and sunny, and you need to have a drop in temperature at night. For this reason, a lot of the rice is cultivated in the highlands or at higher elevations in Japan. You need a lot of precipitation because you need to have lots of water to do the patties. Again, lots of nutrients in the soil. you need to plant in such a way that everything has space to grow so that you have airflow, so there's no mold. All the sunlight is shared equally among the plants. So think about like kind of like canopy management. This is all very, very important. It means that you're making less rice, but it's much higher quality. So in the same way that canopy management will reduce yields, but you get better quality grapes, the same thing is practiced in growing rice. This takes very much skilled farmers. And I mentioned earlier that, you know, you have longer growing seasons, you have the risk of losing your entire crop to a typhoon or bad weather. Not that many growers are willing to risk growing sake rice in Japan. If you're growing table rice, there are table rices that you can grow through the season and get 3 crops. They'll grow so fast, produce a crop, you can grow 3 times, you can basically get paid 3 times through the rice growing season. You're only going to get paid once for that sake rice, and you may not get paid at all if the whole thing is damaged or blown over in a typhoon. So it's a risky business is kind of, I guess, what I'm getting at here. There are over 100 varieties of sake rice, but they account for only 1% of all the rice. So again, thinking about like the risk there and how many people are really willing to take it. It's also extremely expensive. I'm not going to spend too much time on this. So this is just sort of a generalization, but just the point is that premium sake rice is double the price of table rice. So you may want to make a note of that. This is showing you some of the different heights here. The left is that table rice, which is lower to the ground, less likely to get blown over. We can get 2 or 3 harvests a season. In the center is Gohyaku Mangoku, and then you have Yamada Nishiki, which is really quite tall. This picture isn't really good. I'll show you with the omachi later, but this rice gets really, really, really tall. So we're going to talk about the rice varieties. Generally speaking, sake rice can be eaten, but it's not going to be served at the table. What is the note? Oh, yes, I'm sorry. What did I? Oh, here I'm saying you might be asked to know which is more expensive, the table rice or the sake rice on the exam. And I think if you just make a note or remember that sake rice is twice as much as table rice. Okay. So the varieties of sake, of sake rice, have much less impact on the flavors of the sake than grapes do. So, you know, we can all agree that Pinot Grigio tastes dramatically different than Sauvignon Blanc, that, you know, there are major differences in the varietal characteristics between, you know, Pinot Noir and Merlot or whatever you want to get down the rabbit hole on. Every grape has a major, you know, taste profile that should be, you know, evident in the wine, and that's affected by the region. With the sake rice, what's really interesting is that the way that the rice is handled, how much it's polished, tends to have a much higher impact on the ultimate flavor of the sake than the rice itself. The other thing is that there are still some subtle differences, but it's very subtle. It's very hard to notice the difference. You know, as a master of sake, you're much more likely to be asked what the grade is of the sake. You know, is it Junmai Daiginjo? Than to be able to identify what the specific rice strain is. There are a handful that have some pretty clear characteristics that we will discuss, starting with Yamada Nishiki. This is the absolute king of sake rices. I showed you earlier, they have the largest market share for this. Yamada Nishiki comes from Hyogo. There's a Y in Hyogo, so if anybody's wanting you to know, you might remember that Yamada Nishiki comes from Hyogo based on the Y. It is very tough to grow. It's very finicky. I have met sake brewers that are experimenting with growing Yamada Nishiki in their particular prefectures, and they're not happy with the quality. So they still buy Yamada Nishiki from Hyogo, even though they can grow it in their prefecture, but they just doesn't, it's so hard to cultivate, they don't get the same effect. Yamada Nishiki makes extremely floral, fragrant sake, super fruity, very, very expressive. And it's one of the reasons why it's so popular. It's also used quite often for competition sake because it's so vibrant, it just shows itself off. This brings us then to Gohyaku Mangoku, which is from Niigata. And my way of remembering this is there's 2 eyes in Niigata, and Gohyaku Mangoku is named for numbers. So basically, they named it Gohyaku Mangoku the year that Niigata Prefecture had a huge harvest of sake, of rice, just rice in general, includes sake rice and table rice. The total amount of rice that was produced in Niigata exceeded 5 million koku. And a koku is a unit of measurement. So just to break this down, 1 go is about 180 milliliters. And the masu that you see here is usually what's used to measure this. So we drink sake out of this sometimes, but a masu, it represents 1 go. It holds 180 milliliters of sake, and you can scoop rice into that. And if you were to cook that rice, that's intended to be about the serving of rice that one person needs to eat in an entire day. A koku is a measurement of rice that would be to feed a person for a year. Japanese number system is very logical. So go-hyaku means 500 and man means 10 million. So when you say go-hyaku man, you multiply this, you're actually coming up with 5 million. So go-hyaku man is 5 million koku, 5 million portions of rice that would feed a person for a year. The Japanese make all these conjunctions as well, and quite frequently you will see the letter change. So here koku becomes goku, becomes a G. Gohyaku Mangoku is relatively shy. When you think of the Niigata style of sake, again, that magical water with alcohol in it, if you have any more of that sake number 5, take a sip. Remind yourself of how light and airy that is. That is the style of Gohyaku Mangoku. It does not tend to be very aromatic. As I said, it tends to be quite shy. This brings us to omachi. And I love this picture because here you see this grown man and these stalks of omachi rice. And you can see omachi can actually be over 5 feet tall. It can be about as tall as me. Omachi comes from Okayama Prefecture. So again, you can match the O's here to remember where it comes from. And there was a gentleman, Jizo Kishimoto, was sort of hiking through the mountains. And while he was going through, he discovered these 2 giant rice plants that he'd never seen before. And he just basically plucked off and took some grains with him. And the original name for omachi was Nihon Gusa, which translates as 2 original plants. So here it sounds like Nihon, like Japan, but when you look at the kanji, it's actually the kanji for the number 2. Hon, like in Nihon, the original, and then Gusa, meaning plant. So 2 plants were what actually made the whole propagation of omachi possible. Omachi remains the only heirloom rice that is still, well, one of the only heirloom rices that are commonly used in sake production at this point. So there are over 100, just over 100 varieties of rice. About 98 of them of commercial production are hybridized rice. They're rice where they crossed 2 different plants in a lab in order to get a final outcome. So you might have noticed actually that on the Yamada Nishiki, where it says it was created in 1923, but not named until 1936, the history of Yamada Nishiki is really long. It took a long time for them to perfect the crossing of the original plants that made Yamada Nishiki. So omachi is a pure strain of rice. And there's only a few others out there that are being used. One is kame no o, which is actually a table rice, but is used for sake production. It's not a kotekimai. And then wataribune is another one that's out there. It's actually a parent of Yamada Nishiki. So omachi is the most famous, commonly used heirloom rice. Omachi makes fragrant sake, but it's much more earthy. To me, omachi is kind of like the Sauvignon Blanc of sake rices. It can have herbal character, earthy notes, almost a pungent kind of aroma. So this is my favorite slide in the entire presentation, and it's intended to help you remember these different rice types. So if you were to imagine one of the rice types is very fragrant, very buoyant, very, bubbly, and announces itself quite a bit. One of these images would be Yamada Nishiki. One of these images is Go Hyaku Mangoku, which is very shy. And one of these images is, Omachi, which is a bit more earthy, right? You can kind of put together Yamada Nishiki is the cheerleader, Go Hyaku Mangoku is the shy girl, and our hippie chick over here is Omachi. So hopefully that will kind of give you an idea of sort of the differences in the rice strains and what to expect from them. One of the others that's in the book that you may be asked about is Hatan Nishiki, which is developed in Hiroshima. And again, the H's here help you to link these together. Just be careful because Yamada Nishiki comes from Hyogo, but I think you're matching here Y for Yamada Nishiki and Hyogo, H for Hatan Nishiki and Hiroshima. This is a rice that is a modern style, and it was bred for shorter height so that it won't flow over and for being resistant to disease. So, that's something that's been very important for the future of sake, is creating rice types that will be easier to grow and produce rice without so much of a risk to farmers. It also makes sort of a lightly flavored sake, similar in some ways to omachi. So that brings us to Tokute Mei Shoshu. And I inserted this slide here to break down some of the facts that are listed in the book. And let's see here if I can tell you what page we're on. Okay, so on page 13 is where we start getting into Tokute Mei Shoshu. So about 30% of sake falls into Tokute Mei Shoshu. Tokute sort of means like treasured, or toku comes to like tokubetsu, special. So basically, and shu being alcohol, it's specially designated sake is what this translates as. But this is only about 30% of sake produced. So 70% is futsushu. So if you think about this as like the top of an iceberg, right? There's a huge amount underneath the water. This is only about 30% of sake that's produced. This is a similar type of diagram, although it's shaped like a pyramid, as the blue square that we looked at earlier today, where we have no alcohol added on the left and alcohol added on the right. So we know that the sakes are classified based on how much the rice is polished and whether or not they add any alcohol. The percentage, again, is how much rice is remaining after it's polished. So the lower the seimai, the higher the grade. The higher the seimai, the lower the grade. Each of these percentages is the maximum amount of rice that's allowed. And as I mentioned earlier, many polish below that number. So if you want to call your sake daiginjo, you have to polish it down at least to 50%. But again, there's many that are polished way more. But it's same as notable of other categories. So there are producers of ginjo sake where it would classify technically as a daiginjo. And the brewery would choose not to call it a daiginjo if for the standard of that brewery, it doesn't meet their qualification. So like the Hakai-san sake number 5 that we just tasted is actually polished down to Daiginjo grade, but they still only call it their Junmai Ginjo because that's the character that they define their Junmai Ginjo as. We mentioned earlier that Junmai has no polishing requirement. A few other things of note. In order to qualify as Tokutei Meishoshu, again, coming back to those ratios, the Koji Buai, just like we were talking about before, where the book was updated with the water proportion to the rice, 15% of the rice, the total rice, has to be made into koji, at least. They use much less koji in futsushu. A lot of times they'll just add enzymes in order to make futsushu. They'll just melt the rice with enzymes. If alcohol is added, the alcohol can exceed no more than 10% of the total weight of the rice used. So this is that condition that they added where they're going, okay, we're going back to the original form of brewing. We're highly controlling how much alcohol is allowed to be used if it's Tokutei Meishoshu. They can add way more alcohol and other additives to futsushu. Oh, that's duplicated. There's another typo. This is the first time we updated the book since 2007. And the first time I've updated the slides in a really long time. So forgive my typos, guys. I don't even know what's a Tokutei. Go to that slide. So this is a diagram that's in the book. I won't spend a lot of time here, but it's just sort of breaking it down again in another way for you guys. Noticing again that the brewing characteristic varies here for Tokubetsu. Light fragrant, this Ginjo character here is that floral fragrant thing. The way the rice is polished is pretty interesting. So back in the day, actually way back in the day, they would use these mortars and pestles here. So men would stand back on this sort of sawhorse back here, and they would kick this back and forth and sing songs for hours while they ground up the rice with this large mortar and pestle. They would sometimes do it by hand in vessels that they could hold. And then around the Edo period, the invention of the water wheel, as things started to progress, they would start using these water wheels to grind up the rice or mill it in these grinders. But at this time, the most of the outer layers that they could take off the rice would be maybe up to 15%. And a lot of the rice pieces would be broken. It wouldn't be done smoothly in the way that we're able to achieve today with the modern rice polisher. So this vertical rice milling machine was not invented until 1933. And the diagram is a little bit small, but if you notice here, there's a giant hopper at the top. So you can see these hoppers here. And if you were to stand next to this machine, you would probably come up to right about here. So these rice milling machines are usually around, 15 to 18 feet tall. They're quite large. So they fill up this hopper with brown rice. And there's actually a scale on here that allows them to measure the weight. So if they put 1,000 kilograms of rice in this hopper, the rice runs down around this Congo roller, which you can see a close-up of here. This is spinning inside of this area here. And the rice bounces around against the roller and against itself. Powder is ejected, and then the rice pops out, and it's actually fed back up into the top of the machine. And this process goes round and round and round for many hours. When the scale on this 1,000 kilograms of rice, when the scale registers 500 kilograms, and we know that 50% has been polished away, we know that we've reached Daiginjo grade. So that's how they measure how much the rice is polished, is based on the change in the weight. And I mentioned earlier that the bran is expelled and used for other purposes. If you are going to take off down to Daiginjo grade, so 40% is left, it takes 48 hours. But I always like to pause here and note So people kind of will control this in different ways. So sometimes they say 50%, sometimes it's just thinking about in general, getting down to Dai Ginjo grade is 2 full days of polishing. Once they start to go higher in grade, so the lower the polishing ratio, they get more risk of heat buildup and more risk of breaking the rice inside. So they start to constrict the amount of rice that comes into the machine and to slow down the roller. So I don't have exact, figures, but I've been told that Dasai takes up to 3 months to polish the rice for the 23, and even longer for Dasai Beyond. Are there now techniques for polishing rice based on shape? Yes, Yegas, there are. And Elias wants a 5-minute break. We are going to be done at 8, I think. Can you guys hold out until we're done? We might grab the bottles. Is that okay?
Yes.
Okay, cool. Excellent. So the rice.
Thank you so much.
No problem. So the rice, they have to slow down the stone. So basically the more they polish the rice, it just takes a really long time. And the reason why I wanted to explain that is because it's a major part of why these sakes can become so expensive. So this is just another diagram showing you more, again, comparing the different levels of polish to the original rice. And we're going to taste our last flight. So you need bottles 7, 8, and 9. And if you want to take the break now, go ahead and take the break. And we might go a few minutes after, but this is like my favorite tasting in the class. So I'm excited to stop here tonight. So let's taste. Yay, Tara got it because 7, 8, 9, because of this tasting flight. You guys are funny. I'm glad you like my childish humor.
Still number 1 is my favorite.
Oh yeah, you like sake number 7? So here's the test, guys. It's such a dad joke. Yeah, it is. I know. I have a grown daughter, and she rolls her eyes all the time at me. I'm the mom and the dad in our house, so single mom here. So I have to fill both shoes. This is my favorite tasting. We have 3 sakes of the same grade, and they're made with different rice types. So I want you guys just to think back to the slide that had the cheerleader, the shy girl, and the hippie chick. And I want you to find those characters in the sake. One of these sakes is very bright and aromatic. One of them is extremely subtle. And the other one is a little bit more herbaceous and earthy in character. So take a moment to just kind of go through in your own pace and taste. Again, you know, the differences are somewhat subtle. I would say that probably for me, the differences are most likely found in the nose here. This is really hard. I will definitely say that. So let's think about the style of aromatic characteristics too. So one of these sakes to me in the nose is a bit more like damp earth, wet stones, cooked rice. It has a little bit more of an herbal note, almost like a lemongrass kind of note, or almost a green note. One of the sakes is very low in aroma. Like you really have to put your nose down in the glass to get it. And that's sort of what I mean by shy. And then one of the sakes has a perfume to it that's very floral, very fruity. That floral fruity character is a bit of that cheerleader. It's more of that Yamada Nishiki note. Yeah, so Jenna's saying 9 has that mineral feel again, so ricey, earthy. Yeah, I would agree. So sake number 3. Yeah, so really hard on this set. So Melkor, yeah, I agree with you. So this is again, you know, I wanted you guys to do this because it's a really cool tasting, but I also wanted to emphasize like this is really not something you would almost ever really be asked. We do have one exam where this becomes a part of the process, but you know, it's not, it doesn't make or break you. Let me reveal here for you. So bottle number 7 is the Yamada Nishiki. This is from southern Japan, Fukuoka, in Kyushu. And it's the garden's nightingale. It's such a romantic name, Niwa no Uguisu. This, when you smell it here, you'll notice that flowers, lily blossom, lychee, you know, banana, pineapple, a lot of that tropical character. There's also a lot of pear drop to me. It's that almost like a high tone green fruit, almost like muscat grape kind of character in the aromatics here. Quite balanced. It's not quite as showy as some of the other Yamada Nishiki sakes that we've tasted today, but it's still a beautiful example of what to get from Yamada Nishiki. So the next is the Kubota Manju, and this is one of the was for a long time one of the Maboroshi no sakes, one of the sort of phantom sakes in Japan, where it was, you couldn't get it anywhere. we actually are pretty lucky to get this at all in the United States. There was a sort of a television show series that utilized this brand in the 80s where it became a flagship before the whole Tokute Meishoshu system was established. Kubota developed a name for itself in the 80s where they learned how to make this very clean, delicate style, and it became the flagship of the Niigata style. So Gohyaku Mangoku here is very important to that. The rice is reluctant to melt in the brew process. It's sort of a harder style of rice, and it's just not super aromatic. So, you know, they're able to use that very delicate water from snow melt and this sort of delicate type of rice, and they make a very delicate type of sake. Do you notice how fast the finish is there too? Like it's just so clean. This is like the epitome of that kire finish, that pristine, crisp character that Niigata is famous for. The last is made with omachi, and a couple things about this make this unique. So this is from Kyoto. It is made with that Fushimi water. So this is one of those sakes that blows my mind. It's honestly one of my favorites that we taste in this whole tasting because it smells and tastes so different. I don't know if you guys would agree. But, you know, you smell it and you get all that ricey, earthy character. And then, you know, you taste it and it actually has this sweet, soft, round mouth feel. And you really kind of have this unique kind of experience from it. So it has the Fushimi water, but the omachi sort of belies that. It gives it this earthier structure to it. Omachi is also a large rice that's very, very brittle. It's extremely difficult to polish. Most people don't use omachi for daiginjo sake. It's very, very hard to polish. I know one of you was asking about special polishing techniques in order to kind of retain the shape. Daishichi was one of the first sake breweries to perfect their super flat shape polishing, which helped them to make extreme styles of daiginjo sake from omachi rice. So anyway, I hope you guys had fun with that. It's kind of a fun way to end the day. So I'm gonna just zoom through here really quickly on a couple of things. Because of my computer issues, we finished a little bit late, and I appreciate you guys for your patience. So we will start. I intended to get all the way up to where the sake brewing process begins today, which is beginning on page 19. So we just have a few more pages here to do on climate and microbes. So when we come back next week, we will start there. And the main thing I wanted to share there was I'm going to email you guys a matching game. And when you're done, you can email me for the answers. So I'm going to email you just the matching game to start. And then if you email me back, I'll send you the answer sheet so you can check your answers. Does anybody have any questions? I'm sorry that we had such a rough start with my internet. I feel so bad. I hope it was still enjoyable. I know it's a lot of information to take in. Can you imagine doing this all in one day and having to take the exam right after? You guys are kind of lucky. You get a little bit more time.
Is it possible to get some of those slides, because you had some charts in there, which I think do a better job of highlighting some of the things we learned about in the book?
Yeah, so why don't I do this? I'm not allowed to share the PowerPoint, but I can share you the slides that I've added in that I know are mine that are not a part of from what the SSI provided. I'm happy to just sort of capture those and send those out. Let me do that as a PDF, and I'll send that out to you guys along with the matching game. And you know, if you have any other questions or anything, just reach out to me. I'll be seeing you guys next week on Monday, same bat time, same bat channel, hopefully with less computer issues. Oh, you've got a sword in the background. What is that? Somebody's asking you.
Yeah, it's my Marine sword, but the holder is one that my Marines made for me. And I used to live in Iwakuni.
So cool.
Iwakuniに住んでいました。
そうですか。すごいよ。本当にありがとうございますね. Yeah, really, I reflect what Tara said about your service. It's so important.
Yeah.
No, so ですよ. So it's sort of fun when I lived in Japan, I actually, so my dad loved baseball and I loved riding horses growing up. So when we moved to Japan, my dad brought his baseball mitt and I brought my riding boots. And he was like, why are you bringing your riding boots to Japan? I'm like, why are you bringing your baseball stuff? You know, and he ended up finding, he met some GIs on a train who would go and play recreational, like intramural sports at a recreation center just outside of Tokyo. So he went and met these guys and was playing baseball, and right next door, what was there but a horseback riding place. And so I got my first arubaito, my first part-time job in Japan. I would go to school at ASIJ and I would take the train down to Tama Hills and I worked at the recreation center and I taught horseback riding. So yeah, I did joba in Japan. So yeah, we had a lot of really fun memories there, and just a lot of met so many wonderful people who were in the military service there. So, and I admire what you're doing because there are many people who I think didn't necessarily embrace all the culture that surrounded them. Some of them would sort of stay secularly on the base, you know, and I've met a lot of people, you know, that was like the most incredible people who were like, looked at it as such an opportunity to explore Japanese culture. So that's awesome.
We lived about 20 minutes away from Asahi Shuzo, so I took all my officers to go to Desai, and we toured the factory. And Sakurai-san is just an amazing man. He really took the time to walk us through everything. It's just fantastic.
That's a very, very rare opportunity. That's pretty cool. Well, listen, guys, thank you again for your time and attention. Can you clarify, Jason, did you receive my first email too? Did it go to your like junk box?
I think they did go to the junk box. So.
Okay. So maybe add me to your contacts. And so I'm going to resend. Cool. So I'll send you the slides that are sort of clarify some of the stuff in the book, and I'll send you the matching game. All right.
Do you mind sending me the original stuff because it may have auto deleted if you don't mind?
Yeah, no, I will. I'll send you that as well. So yeah, I should have been on the one that I forwarded you with the tasting stuff. That was all I sent out.
It was just two attachments. It was the one with the circles on it, and then there was the tasting sheet. Okay.
That's it. Those two, and then in that email was the link to the Quizlet for you to go through all of the terminology in the back of the book. Yeah. So basically, I honestly recommend making your own flashcards because writing it down is part of the learning process. But if you want to do it with mine, you're welcome to. I can't emphasize enough. I think the one thing that slows people down the most is the language. And some people kind of get freaked out by it. I remind people that Chardonnay is the French name for a grape that we all take for granted. So you can learn the Japanese term for alcohol in the same way. You just kind of have to get used to it. So anyway, じゃあ皆様ありがとうございました。
ありがとうございました。
お疲れ様です。Thank you all. I will talk to you guys next week. It was awesome. Thank you for your patience at the start.
Thank
you. You guys have a great night.
Have a great night.
Bye.
Bye.